She were silver to her own funeral and didn't know it yet. 7 years. 7 years of standing in the shadow of a crown that was never meant for her. Smiling through the venom, bleeding through the silk, learning to mistake endurance for devotion. Seris Vale had done everything right. That was the tragedy. Not that she failed, but that she succeeded. And it still wasn't enough to make a man choose her over power. Tonight, you're going to watch a woman get destroyed in front of an empire, and then you're going to watch her become something that empire never saw coming. Stay until the end. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you are when your whole world changes. The throne hall of House Valor had been built to make people feel small. That was its only honest architectural intention. Every column rose 30 feet before it even considered meeting a ceiling, and the ceiling itself was carved with the death faces of conquered kings. Not idealized portraits, but brutally accurate likenesses, cheekbones sharpened by chisel into something between monument and warning. The candelabras burned with silver fire, a specific alchemical compound that the royal artificers had perfected over 3 generations, designed to cast the Valor bloodline in flattering cold light while making everyone else look slightly ill. Seris had spent 4 years learning to position herself at precisely the right angle within that specific light. That was the kind of knowledge that accumulated when you were not quite royal, but not quite dismissible. You learned the geometry of survival. You learned that the third pillar on the left side of the east colonnade created a natural shadow that swallowed the contempt on Lady Morith's face when she looked at you. You learned that standing 2 steps behind Draven and 1 step to his right made you visible enough to matter, but not visible enough to threaten. You learned to be useful without being threatening. Seris stood now without that calculation. She stood because Draven had told her to be here, in the ceremonial silver dress she had commissioned 8 months ago, when he had first suggested tonight might be significant, and she had let herself believe that significant meant what she needed it to mean. The hall was full. 300 nobles from the northern dominions, the western coastal houses, the river territories. Military commanders in formal blacks. Council members arranged by rank along the north gallery. Servants stationed at intervals along every wall, professionally invisible. Her heart was doing something undignified. She pressed one hand flat against her thigh through the fabric of the dress and breathed through her nose and told herself this was just ceremony, that she was composing herself for ceremony. Draven entered from the eastern archway. And this was the maddening part. The part that had always made rational resistance difficult, genuinely compelling. Not handsome in any easy way. His features were too sharp for that, too defined by the particular combination of breeding and battlefield that the Kalor line produced. But he moved through rooms like he had been told from birth that rooms existed to contain him, and that confidence had a gravity to it that pulled attention without effort. Seris watched him cross the hall. She watched him the way she had always watched him, cataloging the angle of his jaw, the precise cadence of his walk, the way his left hand closed when he was managing something internally that he would not allow on his face. She had spent 7 years learning him. She thought she knew every version. Then she saw his face when Lady Visira Thorn entered behind him. It was not a dramatic expression. That was the thing that cracked something deep and foundational inside Seris's chest. It was not devotion performed for an audience. It was something quieter than that. Something so private it should not have been visible in a hall full of 300 witnesses. It was the face of a man who felt steady. Draven looked at Visira Thorn the way people looked at something they had stopped being afraid of losing. Seris had never once seen him look at her that way. She had received his intensity, his assessment, his moments of warmth that felt like gifts precisely because they were rationed. But she had never received that particular stillness, that private ease. She had been trying to earn a thing he was apparently capable of giving freely, just not to her. The herald's voice carried the announcement in formal imperial cadence. Crown Prince Draven Alos Kalor, heir to the northern throne, declared his royal union with Lady Visira Inara Thorn, of House Thorn of the Crestfall Territories, daughter of High Commander Aldrich Thorn. The hall erupted, not gradually, immediately, as though many of them had been holding breath in expectation of exactly this and could finally release it. The applause was genuine and enthusiastic and told Seris, in that specific quality of genuine enthusiasm, that this had not been news to most of the people in this room. She was the last to know. She was always going to be the last to know. Seris did not make a sound. She was grateful for that later. that her body at least honored the last remaining piece of dignity available to her in that moment. Her face held. She had too many years of practice at holding her face in public for it to betray her now, even when the inside of her chest felt like something architectural had just given way. She looked at Draven. I was accepting congratulations from the Western commander beside him, and his attention swept the hall in that habitual survey he always performed in public spaces, and for exactly 3 seconds his eyes found hers across the distance. He looked, and in his expression was something she could not read precisely. Not guilt, not regret, not apology. Something more complex and more honest than any of those things. Something almost like acknowledgement. Then he looked away. She stood in her silver dress beneath crystal chandeliers in the room she had learned to navigate like a battlefield, and she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had just received the only honest communication he had ever offered her that she had not been betrayed by ambition. She had been betrayed by his complete understanding of what he was doing. He had known. The whole time. He had made a calculation and executed it, and the look he had given her across the hall was not remorse. It was a man who had decided she could survive this, and therefore it was acceptable to do it. The worst part was that he might be right. That was what Seris stood with, in the aftermath of applause, when nobles began moving through the hall and conversations reformed around her like water around a stone, and no one quite met her eyes directly. The possibility that he was right, that she would survive this, that survival was what she was for. A woman named Countess Braille, whom Seris had never trusted but had always maintained careful diplomacy with, appeared at her side wearing an expression of delicate sympathy. "You look pale, darling," Braille said. "Come, I have something that will help." "I don't need help," Seris said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steady. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision, though she had not yet consciously made any decision at all. The voice seemed to know something the rest of her was still catching up to. Braille tilted her head. "The palace physician." "I said I don't need it." She walked out of the hall without asking permission. Boss. The corridor outside the eastern wing ran 70 feet before it branched, and Seris walked all 70 feet without slowing, because slowing would mean stopping, and stopping would mean the thing inside her chest could reach the surface, and she was not ready for that. She was not going to give this palace the satisfaction of her breaking down within its walls. She found a servant's alcove behind the third junction, a narrow, deliberately forgotten space used for linen storage, and went inside and shut the narrow door behind her and stood in the dark. Her breathing was wrong. She pressed the back of her head against the wall and focused on getting the breathing correct. In through the nose. Out controlled. Not the ragged, panicked rhythm trying to take over. 7 years. She had not been naive. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was not some sheltered girl who had believed in fantasy. She had understood from the beginning that court relationships were strategic as much as personal. She had understood that Draven's affection for her existed within the framework of his ambitions, and that framework always came first. What she had not understood, what had apparently been too large a truth for her to absorb until this moment, was that she had been a deliberate placeholder, not a failed candidate for queen, a bridge held open until a better road could be built. "You were never going to be his choice," she said aloud to the dark. "You were his patience. The cruelty of it lived in the efficiency." Draven had not been careless with her feelings. Careless she could have worked with, could have called accidental. Draven had been precise. He had given her exactly enough to keep her stable and positioned and useful, while the actual plan developed in the background, and the only moment of imprecision had been that look across the hall. And she was no longer sure that had been unintentional either. A man who understood everything else that thoroughly would have known what that look would do, which meant even that had been a message. She was sitting on a crate of linen she did not remember sitting on. Her hands were in her lap. The silver dress was going to be ruined by the dust in this alcove, and she found she did not care about that in any way that reached her. "All right," she said. She was not speaking to anyone. She was speaking to the version of herself that had spent 7 years making calculations that served someone else's architecture. "All right, what's actually true?" What was actually true was that she had no title independent of Draven's association. Her family's lands were modest and positioned poorly in the northeastern fringe territories, valuable only as agricultural producers, not strategic or military assets. Her lineage was old but not powerful. She had cultivated court relationships carefully, but always as a secondary player, always with Draven's backing as the implicit authority lending her weight. Without that backing, the weight disappeared. She had built herself into a position that required his existence to function. That was the real devastation beneath the personal one. Not just that he had discarded her, but that she had designed herself around a foundation that was never hers. The door to the alcove opened. Light flooded in from the corridor, and in the doorway stood a man she knew only by sight. Aldrich Thorne's personal envoy, a compact, efficient person named Soren, who had been circling the court for 3 months under the guise of trade negotiations. He looked at her without embarrassment at finding her in a linen closet. "Lady Seris," he said. "My title is currently in question," she said. "What do you want, Soren?" "Information," he said. "In exchange for information." She looked at him steadily. "You have 30 seconds, she said. "Then I'm going to need you to pretend you never saw me in here." "The announcement tonight was not a surprise to the Northern Council," Soren said. "It was scheduled, documented. The betrothal agreement between House Kalor and House Thorne was signed 16 months ago." The number landed like a physical thing. 16 months. She ran the timeline backward in her mind, and it was worse than she expected. 16 months ago, she and Draven had spent 3 weeks traveling through the river territories together. He had been attentive. She had used the word devoted in a letter to her mother. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because House Thorne's arrangement with the Crown includes provisions that directly threaten Eastern territorial sovereignty," Soren said. "And there are people who would like you to understand the full scope of what was built around you before deciding what you want to do next." "People," she said. "Interested people," he said. She stood up from the crate. She realized, no longer doing the wrong kind of breathing. Somewhere in the last 3 minutes, the grief had alchemized into something colder and more precise. And she recognized this state. She had been in it twice before, once during a diplomatic crisis in her 2nd year at court that she had navigated alone, and once during a riding accident that had nearly killed her, and in which she had managed her own emergency with a broken collarbone and no assistance for 6 hours. It was the state where things became very clear, and she stopped worrying about what was comfortable. "Tell your interested people," Seris said, "that I'll need documentation." She did not return to the hall. She did not attend the reception dinner. She sent a message through her chambermaid that she was unwell, a polite fiction that anyone with functioning intelligence would interpret correctly, and spent the night in her quarters reading through the information that Soren delivered via separate messenger 2 hours later. The documentation was meticulous. House Thorne had been negotiating for a crown alliance for 9 years. The agreement signed 16 months ago guaranteed military unification of the Northern and Crestfall forces, under a joint command structure that would effectively give High Commander Aldrich Thorne operational control of the Empire's largest standing army within 3 years of the Royal Union. Draven would gain the most powerful military force on the continent. Thorne would gain the legitimacy of a crown connection, and vice versa. Seris studied the formal portrait that had been included in the documentation, studied the woman's face with the same focused attention she had spent years directing at Draven, and found something that unsettled her more than she expected. Vaisira Thorne was not decorative. She had been at the hall tonight in ceremonial silks and traditional jewelry, and had carried herself with the practiced composure of a woman who understood formal presentation as a tool. But the eyes in this portrait were not the eyes of someone who was content being a political arrangement. There was calculation in them that felt native, not learned. Seris set the portrait aside. "You're not just the price of the military," she said aloud to the empty room. "You wanted the crown as much as he did." That changed the shape of things. Not better, but more honest. A man and a woman who had found each other as genuine strategic partners. That was something entirely different from a political transaction on Draven's end. Whatever Seris had told herself about being replaceable, whatever she had structured as a failure of her own adequacy, the truth was potentially simpler and more final than that. He had not replaced her with a better option. He had recognized a different species of relationship entirely, one built on shared architecture rather than borrowed warmth. She sat with that for a long time. Outside her window, the palace celebrations continued. She could hear the distant orchestra from the great hall. The sound carried across 300 yards of courtyard and arrived to her as something attenuated and strange, like music remembered rather than music heard. Around 3 in the morning, she made her first decision. She was leaving the capital, not fleeing. She understood the difference, and the difference mattered enormously. Fleeing was reactive. Fleeing was the motion of someone still orienting toward the place they were leaving. What she was doing was something else, a deliberate removal of herself from a board on which she had been positioned without her knowledge. So began writing a short list of names. People she trusted with a precision that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with observed behavior under pressure. People who had demonstrated the specific quality of loyalty that had nothing to do with Draven's backing because they had helped her when helping her offered them nothing. The list was short, 3 names. That felt accurate. She wrote below the names, Eastern Territories, fractured borders. What survives outside the Crown's architecture. She had heard, in the oblique way that genuine information traveled through courts, that the Eastern Frontier Territories were not the lawless ruins that Northern propaganda described. That there was order out there, just not the kind that required the Northern Crown's permission. That there was an alpha king in the East whose borders had never officially submitted to Kaelor authority, and who had maintained that independence not through luck, but through a specific and sustained quality of ruthlessness. His name came to her from memory, Kaelin Dracar. She did not know what she intended to do with that name yet, but she wrote it below the 3 names on her list, and then she folded the list and held it, and the orchestra across the courtyard moved into a celebratory waltz that she recognized as the traditional House Kaelor composition played at major royal announcements. She listened to it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she began packing. She was 3 days east of the capital, traveling with her chambermaid Kala and 2 men from her household guard who had chosen to come without being asked when the first royal hunters found them. She had expected this. Not so soon, but she had expected it. They came over the ridge above the Crestfall Road in formal hunting black with the Kaelor mark on their armor. 4 of them, mounted on the heavy-bred coursers that the Crown's enforcement division favored for long territorial pursuit. Their commander was a man named Ross, whom Seris recognized from the palace garrison, a competent loyalist with a reputation for completing assignments without unnecessary complication. He pulled up 30 feet ahead on the road, and his horse threw its head, and he looked down at her small caravan with the expression of a man who had been sent to solve a problem and was calculating the most efficient solution. "Lady Seris," he said, "you're requested at the palace." "I'm traveling," she said. "The Crown Prince requests your return." "I heard you the first time," she said. "I'm traveling." Russ looked at her guards, looked at Kala, looked back at Seris with a recalibrating expression that she recognized, the expression of someone updating their expectation of resistance. He had expected compliance or panic. He had received neither. "Lady, this isn't a request I have flexibility on." "Then we have a problem," Seris said, "because I have no obligation to the palace that I'm aware of. My association with Crown Prince Draven Kaelor was personal, not contractual. It has been publicly ended. I am a private citizen of modest noble lineage traveling through imperial territory, which is my legal right. The Crown Prince, she said, is preparing for his royal union with Lady Vaesira Thorn. He has a great deal to occupy his attention. I'd hate to think he's distracting himself with concern for my travel plans." There was a silence. One of her guards had moved his hand to his weapon without drawing it, just the motion of readiness that changed the texture of a situation. Russ looked at her. "You understand this road gets more difficult the further east you go," he said. "I've heard it builds character," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not respect exactly, but a recognition that recalibrated the calculation. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he moved his horse off the road. "Riders ahead reported a mudslide around the 6th marker," he said, to no one in particular. "A patrol might reasonably have been delayed." He rode back over the ridge. She waited until the sound of hooves disappeared completely before she let out a breath. "That was insane," Kala said, very quietly, from behind her. "That was information," Seris said. "He chose to move, which means Draven's orders are not yet absolute, which means either Draven hasn't fully committed to treating this as a threat, or Russ decided on his own terms that I wasn't worth the conflict. Or he was told to scare you into turning around." Seris looked at the road ahead. The eastern gradient beginning, the trees changing character, the quality of the air already different, colder, carrying something wilder underneath the cold. "Then he misjudged," she said, and moved forward. The frontier territories were not what Northern propaganda said, and they were not what optimistic imagination said either. They were specific. They had a specific quality of attention. The landscape itself seemed to have developed the capacity for threat assessment, every pass and ridgeline configured to observe before being observed. On the 9th day, she understood why. She came to a checkpoint she had not known existed, a structure built into the rock face of a canyon pass so organically that she was standing at its gate before she fully processed that she was at a gate. 2 guards in gray and black, no Kalor markings, armor that was functional rather than ceremonial, faces that held a professional neutrality significantly more unsettling than hostility. Northern travelers require escort from the Drakkar boundary, one said. I'm aware I've crossed a boundary, Seris said. You're aware of whose boundary? Kalin Drakkar, she said. Alpha King of the Eastern Frontier Dominions. Yes. The guard looked at her for a long moment. The look of someone running information against expected categories and finding the fit was wrong. Your business in the Eastern Territories. I'm going to need to speak to someone with authority, she said. What I have to say is too important for a checkpoint. Our authority is sufficient. Your authority is sufficient to hold me here, she said. It is not sufficient to decide whether what I carry is worth your king's attention. That decision needs to be made higher than a canyon gate. There was a pause. The guard spoke quietly to the second. Words she couldn't catch. Then he looked back at her. You'll be escorted, he said. Anything that can be used as a weapon stays here. She left her guard swords at the checkpoint. She kept the documentation from Soren. She kept the list with Kalin Drakkar's name at the bottom. She kept the cold thing in her chest that had replaced the grief. She was held in a frontier garrison for 2 days before anyone came to speak to her. The garrison was clean and spare and organized with a military efficiency that had a different quality than the Palace Guard's organization. No performance in it, no presentation for observers. The efficiency existed because it worked, not because it communicated power. She slept better than she had in 6 months. On the morning of the 3rd day, the door of the room she'd been given opened without a knock, and Kalin Drakkar walked in. She knew him by the weight of the room's attention shifting. He was not what she had built in her imagination. She had constructed something dramatic because drama felt appropriate to the situation. A man shaped by legend, carrying the visual vocabulary of frontier authority. I was tall. That part was accurate. He was built in the specific way of someone whose strength had developed through sustained use rather than deliberate cultivation. His face had been marked by weather, and probably by a few things harder than weather. His eyes were the color of deep water in winter. Not poetic, just accurate. And they moved across her with the assessment speed of someone who made rapid and reliable judgments about unfamiliar variables. He looked at her the way she had learned to look at rooms, like she was a strategic element whose value he was determining. You requested a meeting, he said. I requested authority, she said. Are you it? I'm what you get, he said. Then sit down, she said. This will take a while. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more like acknowledgement that she had managed to say something unexpected. He did not sit. Talk, he said. So she talked. She laid it out without decoration. The 16 months of documented betrothal, the military provisions within the Thorn Alliance, the specific territorial clauses that extended Kalor operational authority toward the eastern boundary, the exact language Soren's documents used about frontier sovereignty. She spoke for 20 minutes without interruption, and he listened with the stillness that she recognized from the best mind she had encountered at court, the stillness of someone who was genuinely processing rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, the room held quiet for a long moment. You came 300 miles into unfamiliar territory, he said, to give me intelligence about my own border situation. I came 300 miles into unfamiliar territory, she said, because I have nowhere else I'm allowed to go that they won't reach eventually. And I'd rather be somewhere useful than somewhere comfortable. He looked at her. What do you want from this? He said. She had thought about this answer for 9 days on the road. I want to understand what I actually am, she said. Not what I was told I was. Not what I was useful for being. I want to know whether there's a version of what I carry in my bloodline that hasn't been edited for someone else's convenience. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, not recognition, but the specific quality of attention that meant a variable had just changed categories in someone's assessment. That's a more complicated request than intelligence exchange, he said. I'm aware, she said. He was quiet for another moment. What do you know about the old Luna lineages? He said. The ones before the consolidation. She knew very little. She knew what everyone in the Northern Court knew, that the consolidation 3 generations ago had unified the various independent Luna bloodlines under Crown oversight, that this had been characterized as protection and in practice had functioned as... Her thoughts stopped. She looked at him. In practice had functioned as erasure, she said slowly. The Kalar Crown didn't want independent Luna power sitting outside its architecture, Kaylin said. So they documented it, categorized it, assigned it a ceremonial role, and then spent 2 generations selectively suppressing its expression through strategic marriage and political pressure. My bloodline, she said. House Seris Vale goes back to the pre-consolidation era, he said. Your great-grandmother was one of the last independent Luna queens before the crown formalized the transition. What she carried did not disappear. It was managed. The room felt different. She wasn't sure if the room had changed or she had. Why are you telling me this? She said. He looked at her with those winter water eyes for a moment that stretched long enough to feel like a decision being made. Because, he said, what's sitting inside you right now, that thing you think is anger, isn't anger. And you deserve to know what it actually is before someone else tells you, and tells you wrong, for a second time in your life. She opened her mouth. The door of the garrison room crashed open. The guard from the checkpoint entrance, the one who had escorted her, stood in the frame with the specific quality of disruption that meant news had arrived at speed. My king, he said. Northern Riders, 40. Full enforcement colors. They're an hour out, and they're not slowing. Kaylin turned from her slowly. 40, he said. Yes, sir. He looked back at Seris once more. In his face was something she had not yet seen from him. Not alarm, because that would have required something to be uncertain about. And what she saw instead was the specific settled quality of a man who had just watched the future clarify into something he recognized. This is no longer just about documents, he said. No, she agreed. He moved to the door. Stay close, he said, without looking back. And before the next hour ends, I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember about your great-grandmother. She almost asked why. She did not ask why, because the look on Kaylin's face told her something she was not yet equipped to fully understand, that the answer to that question was the largest thing she had ever stood near, and it was moving toward her at a speed determined by 40 Northern Riders in full enforcement colors, and whatever she thought she had lost in that palace hall with its silver fire and its carved dead kings, whatever version of herself she had been mourning on the road east, that version was already gone. What was coming through the garrison door in 1 hour's time was not a retrieval, it was a reckoning. And Seris Vale, standing in a spare military room 300 miles east of everything she had ever been, felt for the first time the strange and terrifying sensation of something dormant inside her blood recognizing the shape of what was about to be required. It was not comfortable. It was not safe. It felt like waking up. The hour moved faster than Seris expected. That was the first thing she understood about Kaylin Drakar's world. Time inside it had a different density. In the palace, an hour was a soft and manageable thing, padded with ceremony and procedure and the specific inefficiency of people who had never needed to be fast. In a frontier garrison with 40 enforcement riders 60 minutes out, an hour was a blade edge, and everything unnecessary fell away from it immediately. Kaylin was already moving down the corridor when she caught up to him. You said tell you about my great-grandmother, she said, matching his pace. Her name was Lyra Seris. She ruled the northeastern mountain territories independently for 31 years before the consolidation. I know what's in the family records, which is very little because the records were edited. Edited how? He said, not slowing. Selectively incomplete, dates without events, names without context. The kind of editing that looks like archival negligence until you realize the pattern. He glanced at her sideways. What pattern? He said. Every entry that was removed corresponded to a period when Lyra was documented as being in conflict with the early Kalar authority, Seris said. Not military conflict, political, philosophical. The records stop exactly when she was winning arguments. He stopped walking. She almost ran into him. Kaylin turned and looked at her with the winter-water eyes doing something more complex than assessment now. Something that had a sharper edge to it. You figured that out from edited records, he said. I figured that out from noticing what wasn't there, she said. Absence has a shape when you pay attention. He looked at her for 3 seconds. All right, he said. Here's what matters right now. Your great-grandmother Lyra carried something that the Kalor line spent a generation trying to breed out of the Seris bloodline. They didn't fully succeed. The indicators are there if you know what to look for, and the fact that they've sent 40 riders rather than a standard retrieval unit tells me they know it too. They're not coming to bring you home. They're coming because someone finally did the bloodline assessment they should have done before they discarded you. Seris heard that land in a part of herself she didn't have a name for yet. What are the indicators? She said. We don't have time for the full version. Give me the short one. He looked at her once more with that recalibrating expression. The ability to hold power in a room without performing it, he said. The way you walked into my garrison and the checkpoint guards didn't know what to do with you. The way you spoke to the enforcement captain on the Crestfall Road and he moved his horse. You didn't threaten him. You didn't intimidate him. You just... He paused, and this was the first time she had seen him search for a word. You made the room reorganize around you without force. That's not court training. Court training teaches you to borrow someone else's authority. What you do is something else. She didn't have a response to that. She wasn't sure a response was what the moment required. The garrison's north wall, Kaelin said, moving again. I need you beside me when they arrive, not behind me, beside. Why? Because, he said, 40 riders is a show of force designed to destabilize. I want them to see that you're not a retrieval problem. I want them to see that you're already something else. She walked beside him. The garrison's north wall was the exterior face that overlooked the approach road, and when Seris reached it and looked out over the frontier landscape in the early morning light, she saw the dust rising in the distance that meant the riders were already visible, already closer than an hour now. Someone had underestimated their speed or they had pushed hard through the night. 20 minutes, maybe less. Around her, Kaelin's garrison was shifting into a readiness state that made no noise. That was the specific quality of it that struck her. In the palace, military readiness had always been accompanied by the sounds of performance, the deliberate audible signals of organized force. Here, people simply moved into positions with the efficiency of a system that had rehearsed this particular rearrangement enough times to have removed all friction from it. Kaelin stood to her right. She was aware of his presence beside her in a way she could not attribute to anything she had words for. Not attraction. Or not only that, and this was not the moment for that kind of inventory. It was more functional than that. He occupied space with a specificity that meant you always knew exactly where he was, and there was something almost stabilizing about that. Draven had always moved through rooms with an expansive quality, a spilling outward that demanded you track him. Kaelin contained himself. He was dense rather than large, and that density had a different effect, not the pull of something consuming, but the steadiness of something load-bearing. She thought about that distinction while she watched the riders resolve out of the dust into specific shapes. 40 horses. The Kalor enforcement mark visible even at distance on the chest armor. And at the front, she recognized the configuration before she recognized the face. A command formation that was not Ross. This was someone senior. This was someone who had been sent because the situation had been recategorized. The riders pulled up at the garrison gate with the practiced precision of a military unit that wanted to communicate both competence and numerical superiority without technically making a threat. The man at the front removed his riding helm and looked up at the wall. Seris recognized him. Lord Commander Vayan Aldrich, Senior Enforcement Authority of the Northern Crown. A man who reported directly to the Crown Council and had, in the 7 years she had spent at court, looked at her perhaps 4 times and never with any particular attention. He was looking at her now. Lord Commander, Kaelin said from beside her. His voice carried without effort. You're riding heavy for a courtesy call. Alpha Dracar, Vayan said. We're here for the northern citizen traveling under your protection. Return of the Lady Seris to the capital is requested by the Crown. I don't hold northern citizens, Kaelin said. If the Lady Seris is within my borders, she's here by choice. You can ask her yourself. This was... Seris processed the move as it happened. A deliberate redirection of the interaction center of gravity. Kaelin had just removed himself as the primary obstacle and placed her there instead, which was either a tactical gift or a test, and she suspected both. Vayan's eyes moved to her. Lady Seris, he said, the Crown Prince requests your return. I heard you, she said. The same way I heard Lord Ross on the Crestfall Road. The answer is the same. Something moved in Vane's jaw. Lady, he said, with a patience that was very thin over something harder. You are standing inside an unauthorized territorial arrangement with a frontier commander whose sovereignty has never been formally recognized by the Northern Crown. This is not a neutral position. If you stay, the Crown will be forced to interpret your presence as what? She said. The question came out of her with a flatness that surprised even herself. Vane paused. As conspiracy against the Northern Throne, he said. Then I need you to be very precise, she said. On what legal basis does the Crown Prince of a monarchy claim conspiracy from a private citizen who has chosen to travel to an adjacent territory? Because the document I have in my possession. She was watching his face carefully as she said it. The one detailing the agreements made 16 months ago and their territorial provisions. That document describes a set of decisions made by the Northern Crown that would be considerably more interesting to a frontier alpha than anything I could have arranged in 9 days of travel. The silence from the 40 riders had a quality. Vane's face went through something she catalogued rapidly. Not fear, not quite, but the specific recalculation of a man who has arrived expecting to collect a manageable variable and found the variable had changed shape since the last assessment. Beside her, Kaelin said nothing. This was deliberate. She understood that now. He was letting her hold the weight of this and watching to see whether she dropped it. She did not drop it. I am not conspiring against the Northern Throne, she said. I am a private citizen of modest noble standing who has been publicly released from a personal association with the Crown Prince and who has chosen, legally, to travel. Whatever the Crown has decided to call that is a choice the Crown is making, not me. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kaelin. Alpha Dracar, he said. The Northern Crown has operated on the assumption that your frontier territories exist in a state of informal independence maintained by mutual disinterest. That disinterest is contingent on the eastern borders not becoming a staging ground for northern political complications. Noted, Kaelin said. This is a warning. Also noted, Kaelin said. You've delivered it. My garrison thanks you for the ride. Vane's control was excellent. She had to acknowledge that. He did not react to the dismissal in any way that conceded ground. He simply held the silence for 4 seconds, long enough to make it intentional, not long enough to make it a contest, and then turned his horse, and the formation began to move. She watched until the dust swallowed them. Then she let out a breath that she had not fully realized she was holding. You knew I had the document, she said. I suspected, Kaelin said. I know now. You used me as a forward position. I gave you the option, he said. You made the choice. She turned to look at him. This was the thing about Kaelin Dracar that she was still calibrating, the way he distributed responsibility with a precision that was either deeply respectful or deeply strategic, and she could not yet tell which, or whether the distinction mattered. He had not told her what to say. He had placed her where she could say something and then allowed her to make the call. That was different from anything she had experienced with authority. What happens now? She said. Now, he said, we have 3 to 5 days before Vane rides back to the capital and the Crown decides whether that was a final attempt at quiet resolution or the opening of something louder. Come inside. She followed him off the wall. Inside the garrison, in a room that was clearly used for command functions, maps on every surface, a long table marked with territorial notations she couldn't fully read, light coming from windows positioned at angles that suggested they had been designed to give sightlines while minimizing exposure. Kaelin stood at the table and looked at her with the kind of directness that did not soften itself for comfort. Tell me what you actually want, he said. I told you, I want to understand what's in my bloodline. That's what you want to know, he said. What do you want to do? She thought this was a different question than it appeared. I want to stop being a variable in someone else's calculation, she said. That's a reactive goal, he said. What's the forward version? She looked at him. What was the forward version? She had been running on the forward momentum of leaving and the intelligence exchange and the confrontation at the wall, and she had not yet, she was honest enough to admit this, fully formed the thing beyond survival into the shape of intention. I want the Northern Court to understand, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, that what they discarded was not what they thought it was. Kaelin was quiet. That's closer, he said. To what? To a real objective, he said. Because right now, the Northern Crown is operating on the assumption that you left the capital as a wounded woman who needed to be retrieved before she caused embarrassing complications. What happened on that wall just now is going to change that assessment. Vane is not stupid. He's going to tell the council what he saw, and the council is going to have to decide whether you're a problem or a threat. What's the difference? She said. A problem, Kaelin said, can be managed. A threat has to be answered. She understood. You want them to see me as a threat, she said. I want you to decide what you are, he said. Because whatever you decide, it needs to be true. You can't perform a threat. The court will see through performance. It has to be what you actually are. This was the point. She felt it in the room's quality, in the weight of his attention, where the conversation stopped being about tactics and became something more foundational. He was asking her to do the thing that was hardest after a betrayal of that specific magnitude. Not to rebuild from the wound, but to reassess from before it. To go back behind the 7 years and the silver dress and the careful angular geometry of making herself useful and ask what was actually there. I spent 7 years, she said, making myself smaller than I was. And I told myself it was strategy. I told myself it was patience. But the real reason... She stopped. Say it, Kaelin said. The real reason was that I was afraid of what would happen if I was actually visible. Because I didn't know what I was carrying. I just knew it made people uncomfortable when it showed. So I learned to contain it. The room was very quiet. Your great-grandmother Lyra didn't contain it, Kaelin said. That's why the records were edited. Not because she was a military threat to the early Kaelor line, because she was a political and philosophical one. Because she argued, successfully, that Luna authority was not a ceremonial function assigned by crown permission. It was a sovereign power in its own right. And she was winning that argument, which meant the court's entire architecture of legitimate authority was in danger. Seris sat down at the table, not because she needed to sit, because the weight of what he was describing required a different physical relationship with the room. They suppressed it before she could formalize it, she said. They absorbed it, Kaelin said, made it subordinate, assigned it a role inside a structure they controlled. It's a more effective suppression than elimination because it looks like inclusion. She thought about the 7 years, about the specific ways she had been made welcome in the court, in ways that required her to be less. The praise that functioned as diminishment, the access that required smallness as a precondition. He wasn't just keeping me close for the Alliance timeline, she said. He was keeping me contained. Kaelin didn't answer immediately. This was something she had noticed about him. He did not rush to fill silences with reassurance. He waited until he had something accurate to say. I don't know Draven Kaelor's full calculation, he said finally. But the bloodline assessment the Northern Court apparently just completed, that's not a routine procedure. That's something someone ordered specifically, which means someone, at some point, became concerned enough about what you might be to want it documented. Vaisira, Seris said. Possibly. She's not just a military alliance, Seris said. I said it before, but I didn't fully understand it. She's intelligent. She would have looked at every variable. She would have looked at me. And seen what you were before you did, Kaelin said, that landed with a particular quality. There was no cruelty in him saying it. It was just accurate. Vaisira Thorn had apparently identified the thing Seris was carrying before Seris had identified it herself, which meant the woman was not just a political strategist. She was a threat assessor of a high order. She had looked at a woman being deliberately contained and recognized what the containment was for. That was, Seris turned this over carefully. That was almost a strange form of acknowledgement. Vaisira had seen her more clearly than Draven had. In a different life, in a different structure, that would be something like respect. I'm not going back to the capital to be a symbol of female capability, Seris said. I'm not interested in being the story of a woman who overcame rejection. That's still a story centered on rejection. Kaelin looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize as his version of attention shifting. Then what's the center? He said. The center is the policy, she said. But the center is what Lyra was arguing 30 years ago that was dangerous enough to suppress. The center is the question of whether Luna authority is sovereign or subordinate. And the answer to that question has implications for every arrangement the Northern Crown has built on the assumption that it's subordinate. That is, Kaelin said carefully, a considerably more destabilizing position than a territorial dispute. Yes, she said, the Crown will not treat it as an internal political disagreement. I know. They will treat it as a structural threat to the legitimacy of every alliance they have built in 3 generations. I know, she said again. He looked at her for a moment that had a specific weight to it. Then you understand that whatever line we're discussing crossing right now, that's not the kind of line you walk back across. She met his eyes. This was the moment she had been moving toward since the linen alcove in the palace. Not the rejection, not the road east, not the wall confrontation. This moment, in a room full of maps, with a man who was asking her the question clearly enough that she had no excuse for misunderstanding it. I understand, she said. I need you to say what you're actually deciding, Kaelin said. Not implication. The actual decision. Seris looked at the map on the table between them. The Northern Empire marked in one set of colors. The frontier territories in another. The boundary between them a line that had never been formally negotiated because the Kaelor crown had operated for decades on the assumption that the frontier would eventually submit, and the frontier had operated on the assumption that it wouldn't. I'm deciding, she said, to find out what I actually carry, and then to use it, not for the Northern Court's benefit, not as a performance of capability for anyone's assessment, for the actual argument, Lyra's argument, the one they suppressed. That argument requires more than documents and bloodline theory, Kaelin said. I know. It requires you to be able to hold what you carry without dropping it under pressure. I know that too, she said. I held the wall this morning. Something moved in his face. You held the wall this morning, he agreed, with 40 riders and a Lord Commander and a crown accusation. You held it, and you didn't perform holding it. You just held it. He paused. That's not nothing. It doesn't feel like enough, she said. No, he said. It isn't. Yet. The word yet was a specific thing. She registered it the way you registered the first light before sunrise. Not the thing itself, but the indicator that the thing was coming. You'll teach me, she said. Not a question. I'll give you access to what's already there, he said. Teaching implies you need something external. This is different. You need to stop suppressing what's internal. She looked at him. Why, she said. Not philosophically, specifically. Why does Alpha King Kaelin Dracar of the Eastern Frontier spend time and resources and political exposure on a northern woman he met 3 days ago? The question sat between them. He didn't deflect it. Because, he said, the document you brought me was genuinely useful. Because the way you moved through my checkpoint was something I've seen 3 times in my life, and every other time it was a person who understood exactly what they were. Because if Lyra's argument ever gets made completely, made with evidence and standing and genuine authority, the Eastern Territories benefit from a Northern court that has to acknowledge Luna's sovereignty. And because... He stopped. She waited. This was the first time she had seen him make the pause that was personal rather than tactical. Because, he said finally, the Kaelor line has spent 30 years managing my borders by banking on the assumption that I have no interest in Northern politics. They miscalculated when they discarded you how interested I would become. The room held quiet for a moment that was different from the previous silences. Then a knock at the door, hard and rapid. The guard from the checkpoint entrance. She was beginning to recognize him, young, capable, the specific quality of someone promoted because they were competent rather than connected. My king, he said. The Northern Riders didn't leave. Kaelin turned. Where? 3 miles back on the approach road. They've stopped. They're making camp. Vayan, Seris thought. Vayan had not taken the dismissal at face value. Vayan had turned the horses and then stopped, which meant either he was waiting for orders from the capital, or he was waiting for something to happen inside the garrison, or he was waiting for her to come out. He thinks I'll change my mind, she said. Or he thinks I'll hand you over when I consider the strategic cost more carefully, Kaelin said. 40 riders is also a message to me. What's your response? She said. Kaelin looked at the door, then at her. The calculation moved through his face in a way she was learning to read, not slowly, but completely. He processed fast and clean, and when he arrived at a decision, there was no hesitation residue, no waffling. The decision was simply present. My response, he said, is to send Vayan's camp a gift. What gift? She said. Kaelin looked at her with those winter water eyes and said something that changed the shape of every arrangement she had understood herself to be inside. A formal declaration, he said, of Eastern territorial recognition of the Seris bloodline as a sovereign Luna house, independent of Northern Crown authority, with full standing under frontier law. The word sovereign hit her somewhere structural. "That's not a gift," she said. "That's a declaration of intent." "Yes," he said. That forces Draven's hand. "Yes," he said again. He can't ignore a formal sovereignty declaration. The Council will demand a response. The Thorn military alliance will be invoked. This starts... She stopped. "Yes," Kaelin said, for the third time, each repetition quieter and more absolute than the one before. "This starts it, and I need to know." His voice was still even, still measured, but underneath it was something that she recognized as the specific gravity of a man who had carried significant decisions for a long time and had learned to carry them without showing the weight. "I need to know if you're prepared for what starting it means. Not abstractly, specifically. The Northern Crown will formalize you as an enemy. Your family estates will be seized if they haven't been already. Anyone who has maintained association with you will be pressured. And the Thorn military, which is now formally allied with the Kaelor Crown, will be directed at these borders. Gaze." Sarah stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the frontier landscape held its particular quality of watchfulness. The mountains in the middle distance. The tree line that had already begun changing into something older and less managed than anything in the northern territories. The sky above it all, a winter blue that had no softness in it, only clarity. She thought about the palace hall, the silver chandeliers, the sound of 300 people applauding a future that had never included her. She thought about Draven's face across that distance, the 3 seconds of acknowledgement that had been more honest than 7 years of proximity. She thought about what Kaelin had said, a ruler who loves nothing else. She had spent 7 years in proximity to that specific vacancy and called it love because the warmth that substituted for it was convincing enough when you needed it to be. That was the real cost of what had happened, not the rejection, the time. She turned back to the room. "Send the declaration," she said. Kaelin looked at her for one more moment. Then he moved to the door and said 3 words to the guard outside, and the machinery of consequence began turning with a finality that she could feel in the walls of the garrison, in the quality of the air, in the specific way that certainty had a different texture than hope. She was no longer the woman who had stood in the silver dress beneath the chandeliers. That woman had been the end of something. This, standing in a military room 300 miles east of everything she had understood herself to be, with the sound of a declaration being written in the next corridor that would reach 40 northern riders in an hour and the capital in 3 days and Draven Kaelor's council chamber in 5. This was the beginning of something that had no name yet because it had not happened yet. And in the moment before the courier's horse left the garrison gate, carrying the document that would formalize the shape of the next several years of conflict, Seris felt for the second time the thing that had no name awakening in her bloodline, pressing against its long containment, recognizing in the eastern frontier air and in the declaration being written in her name and in the specific quality of the man who had written it. Something that her great-grandmother Lyra had apparently once stood beside and called by its right name. Not safety, not rescue, sovereignty. 40 riders 3 miles south of the garrison gate received their document at dusk, and Lord Commander Vane Aldrich read it in the failing light with his enforcement commanders gathered around him, and his face went through something that the courier would later describe as the expression of a man who had just understood that what he had been sent to prevent had already happened, and that the capital was going to need to be told something none of them had been prepared to say. The Northern Crown's assumption of informal, manageable frontier independence had just become something entirely different. And somewhere in the capital, in a palace still carrying the residue of celebration, Crown Prince Draven Kaelor was going to read a sovereignty declaration bearing the name of the woman he had looked at for 3 seconds across a crowded hall and decided could survive it. He had been wrong about what she could survive. He was about to find out how wrong. The declaration reached the capital in 3 days, as Kaelin had calculated. What neither of them calculated was what arrived at the garrison on the 4th day in return. It came before dawn, carried not by an official courier, but by a single rider on a horse that had been pushed past its reasonable limit. The animal was lathered and trembling when it came through the garrison gate, and the rider was a young man Seris did not immediately recognize, dressed in civilian clothes that were travel filthy, and carrying the specific quality of someone who had ridden through the night on the understanding that stopping was not an option. She was awake because she had barely slept. She had spent the previous 3 days working with Kalen's Eastern scholars on Lyra's documented arguments, the fragments that had survived outside the Northern archives, preserved in Frontier records precisely because the Frontier had never submitted to Kalor editorial authority. The work was consuming and occasionally devastating, because reading Lyra's surviving words was like reading a version of herself that had been allowed to develop fully, and the contrast between what Lyra had been and what Seris had spent 7 years becoming was not comfortable material. But it was honest material. And honesty, she was learning, was the specific currency that had value in Kalen's world when almost nothing else did. She was in the Eastern Records room when she heard the horse come through the gate, and something in the quality of the commotion brought her to the window, and she saw the rider dismount with the stiff urgency of someone carrying news they had not wanted to carry. She was in the courtyard before anyone came to find her. The rider looked up when she appeared, and she recognized him then. One of her household guard, the younger one, Pell, who had not been among the two who had chosen to accompany her east. He had stayed in the capital, which had been a choice she had respected without pressure. He looked at her now with an expression that told her the news was bad before he opened his mouth. "Lady Seris," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Your family estates were seized 2 days ago," he said. "The Northern Council issued a formal conspiracy decree. Your mother and your younger brother were taken into Crown custody pending tribunal assessment of their involvement in—" He stopped, and she could see him managing something, and she appreciated that he managed it quickly. "Pending assessment of their involvement in your activities." The courtyard held the particular stillness of early morning, and she stood in it and let the information reach her completely, rather than deflecting any part of it. Her mother. Her brother Kyle, who was 19 and had never once been interested in court politics, and whose primary ambition in life was to manage the northeastern farming territories with genuine competence. Kale, who had sent her a letter 6 weeks ago, asking whether she thought the spring barley yield projections were realistic given the dry season. Kale in Crown custody. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh, the same gesture from the palace hall. Different context, same function. "What else?" she said. Pell looked at her. "The decree names Alpha King Dracar as a co-conspirator," he said. "The Northern Council is framing the Sovereignty Declaration as an act of aggression against imperial territorial integrity." She understood the architecture of this immediately. It was elegant in the specific way that Draven's mind worked. She had learned his patterns in 7 years, and she recognized them now even deployed against her. The conspiracy decree transformed her from a private citizen making a political argument into an active threat actor. The co-conspirator framing transformed Kalen's Sovereignty Declaration from a legitimate frontier legal instrument into an opening move in a hostile campaign. And the custody of her family transformed the entire situation into a personal leverage instrument that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the oldest pressure mechanism available. "Come back, or they suffer for what you started." "Where is Kalen?" she said. "Here," said Kalen's voice from behind her. She turned. He had come from the command room, and from the quality of his expression, she understood that Pell had not been the first to deliver this information. He had his own intelligence network, and he had probably known for hours before the rider arrived. "You knew," she said. "Since last night," he said. "You didn't wake me. You needed the sleep," he said. "And the information wasn't going to be different at dawn than it was at midnight." She looked at him and felt something hot move through her that was not quite anger and not quite the thing that lived beneath anger, but it had the particular quality of betrayal's early warning system, and she needed to address it directly before it became something it wasn't. "Don't make that kind of decision for me again," she said. His expression did not shift defensively. He absorbed it. "Understood," he said. "They have my family." "I know. This changes the calculation." "Yes," he said. "Come inside." She followed him, Pell trailing behind them, into the command room where the maps covered every surface and where 2 of Kalen's senior commanders were already present. A woman named Dara, who ran the Eastern Intelligence Network with a cold efficiency Series, had come to respect quickly, and a man named Voss, whose function appeared to be logistics, but who had the eyes of someone who had made decisions about human life at scale and carried that weight without performance. Kalen stood at the head of the table. "The conspiracy decree was anticipated," he said. "The family custody was not. That's a more aggressive position than the Northern Council typically takes in the opening stage of a territorial dispute. It means someone is pushing harder than the standard protocol would call for." "Vaya Sira," Seris said. Dara looked at her. We believe so, Dara said. Our capital sources indicate that the military alliance provisions were invoked within 6 hours of the sovereignty declaration arriving. That's the Thorn influence. Aldrich Thorn's position within the military command structure has already been formalized. He's in operational meetings with the Crown Garrison Command. Seris thought about the portrait, the calculating eyes. Vaisira had seen her clearly. That assessment had apparently translated into an immediate and decisive pressure response. The moment the declaration made Seris a formal variable rather than a discarded one. Whatever the Northern Court had underestimated about Seris, Vaisira had not underestimated it. That was a dangerous quality in an adversary. It was also clarifying. They will not release my family regardless of what I do, Seris said. The room went quiet. Say that again, Kaelin said. This isn't leverage, she said. If it were leverage, it would come with a specific offer. Return to the capital, and your family is released. Has there been any such offer? Pell shook his head. Only the decree. Then it isn't leverage, she said. It's a wound. It's designed to destabilize my decision-making, not redirect it. If I go back to try to negotiate their release, I go back on the Crown's terms, into Crown custody, and I become a symbol of the consequence of challenging Northern authority. My family stays in custody as a reminder to anyone else who considers the same argument. If I stay east and continue, my family's situation becomes the public face of what my choices cost the people who love me. The room was very still. Either path, Kaelin said carefully, they win something. Either path, she agreed, they win something, which means the calculation is not about choosing the path where I win. It's about choosing the path where I control what they win. Dara looked at her with an expression that was the closest to approval Seris had seen from that particular face. Voss made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated something like recalibration. Kaelin looked at her with the winter water eyes and said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to have texture. What's the path where you control it? He said. I need to know how secure the custody situation actually is, she said. Location, conditions, whether there are existing sympathies within the guard structure that could be worked. And I need to know how quickly the Northern military can mobilize the Thorn Alliance forces toward these borders. 40 days minimum for full mobilization, Voss said. Thorn's forces are positioned in the Crestfall territories, which is 3 weeks' march from the Northern garrison. Integration of command structures adds time. 40 days, she said. Give or take. She looked at the map. 40 days was specific. 40 days was a window that had shape and boundary, which meant it was workable in ways that unlimited time was not. Unlimited threat was paralyzing. A 40-day window was a problem with solvable dimensions. I need to go back to the documentation, she said. Not just Lyra's arguments. The original consolidation treaties. The legal framework the Northern Crown used to formalize Luna subordination. Because if that framework has procedural vulnerabilities, it does, said Dara. Everyone looked at her. Dara moved to the table and placed a single document on the map. Old, the paper with the particular quality of age that meant it had been carefully preserved because someone had understood its value. The Consolidation Accord, she said, signed by the original Luna houses and the Kaelor Crown 3 generations ago. The Northern Court has always presented this as a voluntary unification. What they have not presented is the secondary document, the conditional clause, that specifies the terms under which the original agreement could be nullified. Seris stared at the document. There's a nullification clause, she said. One that requires, Dara said, a Luna House of pre-consolidation standing to formally declare the terms of the original accord violated. Specifically, the accord guaranteed Luna House's continued autonomy in matters of marriage and bloodline succession. The Northern Crown's documented practice of strategic marriage interference. She looked at Seris with a directness that acknowledged what was being said, is a violation of that clause. The room rearranged itself around this information. Seris understood now why Dara had said nothing about this until this moment. It was not a casual piece of intelligence. It was a weapon, and weapons had to be offered at the right moment to the person with the standing to use them. Why do you have this? Seris said. Because, Dara said, my king has spent 11 years preparing for the possibility that the Northern Crown would eventually overreach badly enough to justify formal challenge. The Sovereignty Declaration was the first move. This is the second. Seris looked at Kaelin. He had his arms crossed and was watching her with the expression she had come to understand meant he was giving her space to process rather than directing her toward a conclusion. "You've been building toward this," she said, "before me." "I've been building toward a legitimate challenge to Northern Imperial authority," he said. "The specific shape it would take depended on the specific circumstances. You are the specific circumstances." "I am a circumstance," she said. "You are," he said, with a flatness that refused to soften it, "the most important circumstance of the last 30 years. Because you have the bloodline, the standing, the personal grievance, the documentation, and it—" He looked at her steadily. "The quality I've been waiting for." "What quality?" she said. "The ability to hold the room without losing yourself in it," he said. "Anyone can hold a room angry. Anyone can hold a room performing. You held that wall in front of 40 riders, and you were neither. You were just present, accurate. That's the thing that can't be manufactured." The honesty of this was uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with doubt. It was uncomfortable because it was the most clearly she had been seen in. She ran the count, and it arrived at a number she wasn't ready to say. "My family," she said, "is the priority that has to be separated from the strategy," Kaelin said. "Dara has contacts inside the Northern Custody infrastructure. We begin extraction planning immediately. That is a parallel track, not a dependent one. If extraction fails," she said, "then we account for that when it fails," he said. "Not before." She nodded. Then the door opened and the shape of the next several hours changed. The person who came through it was not a guard and not a courier. It was a woman, tall, road-worn, wearing Eastern frontier traveling clothes that did not fit her the way clothes fit someone accustomed to wearing them. They fit her the way clothes fit someone who had chosen them deliberately for their anonymity. Seris recognized her face. She had studied that face in a formal portrait 4 days ago. Viasira Thorne stood in the doorway of Kaelin Drakar's command room and looked at the assembled group with the specific quality of calm that belonged to someone who had calculated the risk of this action and decided it was the correct one. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seris had experienced in a room full of people who were all, very rapidly, updating every assumption they had been operating on. Kaelin moved first, not toward Viasira, sideways, a positioning shift that put himself between the doorway and Seris without making it look like protection. It looked like he was simply choosing where to stand, but it wasn't. "Lady Thorne," he said. "Alpha Drakar," Viasira said. "I'm alone. I came without escort and without the Crown's knowledge. I need 20 minutes. "You need my decision on whether to give you 20 minutes, Kaelin said, "which requires a reason." Viasira looked at Seris, and this was— Seris held herself very still and paid very close attention to this. This was not the look of an adversary calculating an opening. It was the look of a woman who had been carrying something at significant personal cost and had decided to set it down, and was watching to see what happened when she did. "Because," Viasira said, "the family custody order was not mine. The room processed this." "Say that precisely," Seris said. Viasira stepped fully into the room. She moved without the performance of confidence that Seris had braced for. She moved with a directness that was simply functional, and she sat at the table without being invited and looked at Seris across its surface. "I'm going to tell you something that ends my political position within the Northern Court if it reaches the wrong ears," she said. "I'm telling you because the alternative is watching a strategy play out that is going to cost people who don't deserve it enormously, and I find I am unwilling to do that." "Why?" Seris said. "Because I am not what the arrangement made me," Viasira said. "And I think you understand that specific problem better than almost anyone I could have this conversation with." The room held its breath. Seris looked at the woman who had, in the space of a single evening, replaced her in the public architecture of Draven Kaelor's life. She looked at her across the table in an Eastern frontier garrison, 300 miles from the palace chandeliers and the silver dress and the 3 seconds of acknowledgement, and she found something she had not expected to find. Recognition. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not anything simple, but the specific recognition of one person seeing another person's specific form of trapped, and knowing it by the particular quality of effort required to hold the surface steady. "Talk," Seris said. Viasira talked. What she said took 18 minutes, not 20, and it rearranged every calculation in the room, including several that Kaelin had apparently been operating on for 11 years. The Thorne military alliance had been Aldrich Thorne's negotiation, not Viasira's. She had been informed of the arrangement's existence 7 months into its development, presented with its terms as a concluded decision, and given the specific clarity that her role within it was to be exactly what she had appeared on the announcement night: legitimate, composed, and strategically valuable without being strategically independent. She had accepted this because the alternative had been the specific kind of erasure that families of military dynasties practiced on daughters who declined to be useful. "My father," she said, with a flatness that carried enormous weight beneath it, "is not a man who permits opposition from within his architecture." She had accepted it. She had performed the role. She had done the portrait, and the announcement, and the ceremonial presence, and all of it, with the specific competence of someone who understood that survival sometimes required inhabiting a role you had not chosen. "But the family custody order came from my father," she said, "not from Draven. Draven issued the conspiracy decree because the council demanded a formal response to the sovereignty declaration. The custody provision was added by my father's faction within the council without Draven's specific approval." "Draven signed it," Seris said. "Draven signed the decree," Viasira said. "He did not read every provision before he signed it. That is not an excuse. It is a fact about how my father operates. He has spent 30 years inserting provisions into documents that the signing authority did not fully review." Seris sat with this. The information was destabilizing in a specific way that she needed to hold carefully. It did not absolve Draven. A man who signed decrees without reading them was not a man who could be trusted with the weight of what he was signing. But it changed the shape of the adversary structure. It meant that the entity directing the most aggressive pressure was not the Crown itself, but the military alliance that the Crown had invited inside its architecture, and was now discovering it could not fully control. Draven had let the wolf in the door for the strength of its teeth, and was now learning that wolves did not distinguish between property and threat. "Why are you here?" Kaelin said. Viasira looked at him. "Because the consolidation nullification document," she said, "exists in 2 copies. The Eastern Frontier copy, which you have, and a second copy which my father has held for 9 years in the Thorn family archive as insurance against the possibility that the Northern Crown might one day turn on the Thorn Alliance." The room went completely still. "Your father has the second copy," Seris said. "He's been holding it as a theoretical leverage instrument against the Crown," Viasira said. "He never intended to make it publicly known that he had it, because its existence implies that he has been planning for the possibility of Northern Crown betrayal since before the alliance was signed." "He doesn't know you're here," Kaelin said. "He does not." "When he finds out," Kaelin began. "He will find out," Viasira said. "I'm not operating under the illusion that this stays contained. When he finds out, my position within his plans becomes—" She stopped. The word she did not say sat in the space she left it. "I need something in exchange." "What?" Seris said. Viasira looked at her. "I need the Eastern Territories to acknowledge that if I deliver my father's copy of the document and testify to the council manipulation practices, I have standing as a political refugee under frontier law." "You're asking for asylum," Seris said. "I'm asking for a future that is not defined by my father's architecture," Viasira said. "The same thing you are asking for. We are asking for the same thing from different directions." The silence that followed was the longest in the room. Seris looked at the woman across the table. The woman who had been positioned, as she had been positioned, inside a structure neither of them had fully designed. The woman who had been called an adversary, a replacement, a political weapon, and who had ridden 300 miles in civilian clothes because something inside her had reached the specific breaking point where the cost of compliance finally exceeded the cost of resistance. There was a philosophy in this moment that Seris felt with the clarity of something understood at the bone level, rather than the intellectual one. Power did not merely corrupt the people who held it. It corrupted the structures built around it. It reached into every adjacent life and bent it toward its own service. And the people caught in that bending were not villains or victims. They were human beings making calculations in a system that had been designed to leave them no clean choices. That was the thing that Draven had never understood, and Aldrich Thorn had never cared to understand, and that Lyra had apparently spent 31 years trying to argue before the court suppressed the argument. Power without accountability consumed everything it touched, even the people it meant to protect, even the people it meant to use. Seris looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked at her. In his expression was the specific quality she had come to read as genuine consultation, not direction, not permission, but an actual question being asked by a man who had already formed his own position and was genuinely willing to be moved. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Lady Thorne," he said to Vaisira, "the Eastern Frontier acknowledges your request for political standing under frontier law, conditional on the delivery of the document and testimony you have described. You have my word on that." Vaisira held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into the traveling clothes and produced a sealed document that she set on the table between them. "This is a copy I made from my father's archive before I left," she said. "The original remains in Thorne custody. Getting it out requires physical access to the archive, which requires," she paused, "a reason for me to be inside the Thorne estate without my father knowing why." "You're going back," Seris said. "I have to go back," Vaisira said. "If I disappear without explanation, my father knows within a day what I've done and moves the document. I need to return, retrieve the original, and get out before the Alliance military mobilization reaches full deployment, 40 days. Seris felt the cold thing in her chest recalibrate around this new shape of things. 40 days. The same window, a different set of moving parts within it. The same pressure, now with an internal variable inside the enemy's own architecture. She looked at Vaisira Thorne, who had ridden 300 miles on a horse to put herself in this room, and she thought about what it had cost that woman to do this. Not in tactical terms, but in the human terms underneath the tactical ones. The cost of looking at the structure you had been built into and deciding that the structure was wrong. The cost of choosing a different path when every path available carried its own form of damage. She understood that cost personally. "When you go back," Seris said, "I need you to carry something for me." Vaisira looked at her. "My family," Seris said, "in Crown custody. I need to know their conditions, and I need a contact point inside the custody infrastructure." "I can do that," Vaisira said. "And I need you to deliver a message," Seris said, "to Draven, personally, not through channels." The room waited. "What message?" Vaisira said. Seris looked at the map on the table. The Northern Empire in one set of colors, the frontier in another, the boundary between them that had just become something it had never been before. Not a line between submission and independence, but the front edge of a question that had been waiting 30 years for someone with the standing to ask it formally. "Tell him," Seris said, "that I am not coming back. Tell him that what he built his crown on has a structural crack that was always there and I did not put it there. Tell him that the question his great-grandfather suppressed is going to be answered now, and the answer will be on the record, and every arrangement the Northern Court built on the assumption that Luna authority is subordinate is going to have to be renegotiated from the foundation." She looked up. "And tell him that the only version of this that ends without destroying everything he inherited is the version where he chooses to be part of the answer instead of part of the problem. He has 40 days to make that choice." Vaisira looked at her for a long moment. "He won't listen," she said. "I know," Seris said, "but he needs to hear it clearly before he decides not to, because when it's over, he won't be able to say he wasn't told." Vaisira stood. She looked at Kaelin once, a look that was an assessment and an acknowledgement, and something that existed between those two things. And then she looked at Seris with an expression that had moved past the careful neutral of political performance into something rawer and more honest. "For what it's worth," Vaisira said, "I looked at you the night of the announcement. I knew what I was replacing and I knew what it had cost you. I want you to know that I knew." Seris held her gaze. "I know you knew," she said. "That's why you're here." Vaisira left. The room held her absence for a long moment, and then Dara said something quiet to Voss about document verification and logistics, and the machinery began turning again, but Seris stood at the table and looked at the copy Vaisira had left behind, and felt something shift in her understanding of the next 40 days in a way that was not hope. Hope was too light a word for what it was, but was something in the family of hope, something with more structural integrity than hope usually carried. Kaelin came to stand beside her, not close, not a performance of proximity, simply beside her, the way a load-bearing thing stood beside what it was supporting, not merged with it, not possessive of it, but present in the way that presence mattered. "She might be turned," he said quietly. "Her father is capable of identifying what she's done and using her as a countermove." "Yes," Seris said. "If she's turned, everything she's told us becomes a vector for misinformation." "Yes," she said again. "You trust her anyway." She considered this. "I recognize her," she said. That's not the same as trust. But recognition is a starting point that has more structural integrity than assumption. He was quiet beside her for a moment. 40 days, he said. 40 days, she agreed. Outside the garrison windows, the frontier morning had fully arrived, the sun having cleared the mountain line to the east and beginning the long work of warming air that held cold as a default condition. The landscape had its watchful quality, and somewhere in it, Viasira Thorn was riding back toward the life she had temporarily stepped out of, carrying a message that would reach Draven Kalor's personal space and land there with a weight that no official diplomatic channel could replicate. And somewhere in Northern Crown custody, Kale was probably asking sensible questions about spring barley to guards, who had no idea what to do with someone whose primary concern was agricultural projections. Seris was going to get him out. She was going to get her mother out. She was going to do the thing Lyra had spent 31 years arguing for and had not been allowed to finish. She was going to stand in front of the Northern Council with the Consolidation Accord and the Nullification Clause, and the full documented weight of 3 generations of deliberate Luna suppression, and she was going to make Lyra's argument with the specific quality that Lyra had apparently possessed, and that Seris had spent 7 years being managed into not using, not performing it, not borrowing someone else's authority to make it, just being what she was, completely, without the editing. She reached out and picked up the copy Viasira had left on the table. The paper was real and specific in her hands. Weight and texture, old language and careful script. The legal foundation of an argument that the Northern Court had suppressed because a woman 30 years ago had been winning it. This time, she was going to finish it. 40 days, or everything she loved paid the price of her choosing to be visible. There was no version of this where she walked back to the smaller life. The editing was over. The 40 days did not hold. They lasted 23. Aldrich Thorne moved the military mobilization forward on day 16. Dara's intelligence network confirmed it at midnight, the information arriving in fragments that assembled into a picture worse than the projected timeline. The Crestfall forces had not needed 3 weeks to march. Thorne had pre-positioned 2/3 of his alliance army 6 weeks before the sovereignty declaration, which meant the mobilization had been planned before Viasira had ridden east, before the document had been delivered, before any of them had understood the full shape of what they were inside. Thorne had known the declaration was coming. He had been waiting for it. Seris was in the records room when Dara brought the intelligence, and she stood up from Lyra's documents and looked at the woman's face and understood from the quality of it that the next words were going to require every piece of clarity she had been building in the past weeks. How many? She said. 12,000 Thorne Alliance forces, Dara said. Moving through the Crestfall passes now. Northern Crown Garrison contribution is an additional 4,000 under joint command. 16,000 total, 7 days out. 7 days. The Eastern Frontier Standing Force was 4,000 soldiers of exceptional quality who had spent their careers fighting in terrain they knew with an intimacy that no invading force could replicate. Numbers were not the entire calculation, but numbers were not irrelevant either. She went to find Kalen. He was already in the command room with Voss and 3 senior field commanders, the maps on the table covered in new markings, and when she walked in, the room received her without adjustment. No shift of energy that marked her arrival as an interruption, no management of the space to accommodate her. She was simply present in it, and the room accepted that the way rooms accepted variables that belonged. She had noticed this about Kalen's world in the weeks she had been inside it. He did not organize his space around dominance performance. He organized it around function. And the function of this room right now was war planning, which meant everyone in it, including her, was a working part of a single calculation. They pre-positioned, she said. 6 weeks ago at minimum, Kalen said. He was looking at the map with an expression she had come to read accurately, not the absence of emotion, but the specific compression of it that high-stakes decision-making required. He was not calm. He was controlled. The difference mattered enormously. Thorne knew the sovereignty declaration was the trigger. He set the board before I moved the piece. Viasira, Seris said. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. Thorne is capable of anticipating this without inside information. He's been watching these borders for 11 years. He knows my patterns. What he didn't anticipate, said one of the field commanders, a man named Rourke, whose face carried a scar from the jaw to the temple that spoke to the kind of career decisions that left marks, is that we saw it. 2 days earlier than his intelligence probably expects. What is 2 days by us? Seris said. The Eastern Canyon passes, Rourke said. There are 3 viable routes for an army of that size through the frontier boundary. We can't hold all 3 with 4,000. But if we know which route is primary and which are diversions, we can concentrate and make the terrain do the work. The numbers can't. How do we know which is primary? She said. Rourke looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked at her. She understood from the quality of that look that the answer to this question involved something she was going to be asked to do rather than something that had already been done. Visera's contact, she said. She gave me a message channel before she left. She said use it only if the timeline collapsed. The timeline collapsed, Kaelin said. She was already moving. The message channel Visera had established was a relay system using Eastern frontier traders who moved between the border territories. People who had commercial relationships on both sides and whose movement attracted no particular attention. A message inserted into the relay at the frontier end could reach a specific contact point inside the Northern Territory within 2 days. 2 days out of 7 was a third of the window. Seris wrote the message herself, in a cipher Visera had given her, a simple enough system that required knowing the key, which was a passage from a pre-consolidation text that Visera had referenced during their conversation in the command room. The choice of key was Visera telling her something about what she had been reading and thinking about. Seris had noted it and said nothing at the time. She sent the message and went back to work. There were other things to prepare that did not require Visera's intelligence. In the 3 weeks since she had picked up Lyra's document from the table, Seris had done something that existed alongside the military and strategic preparation, but was not the same kind of work. She had been learning, not ceremonially, not as a performance of capability for Kaelin's approval or the Frontier's assessment. She had been sitting with the specific thing inside her bloodline that she had spent 7 years suppressing and learning to stop suppressing it. This was harder than anything else she did in those 3 weeks. Not because it was complicated, because it was the opposite of complicated. The thing she was learning to hold was not elaborate or constructed or dependent on strategy. It was the simplest version of what she was, stripped of all the management and containment and careful angular geometry she had applied to herself in the palace. And simple things were frequently more difficult than complex ones because they left no place to hide inside their complexity. Kaelin had been present for this without being directive about it. He had said early on that he would give her access to what was already there rather than teaching her something external, and that had been accurate. He did not instruct. He created conditions. He put her in rooms where decisions had to be made and let her make them. He gave her problems with real stakes and stood beside her while she worked through them without cushioning the stakes or managing her response to them. There was a specific kind of respect in that which she had not previously encountered in a relationship with power. Draven had managed her. He had managed her with genuine care in his fashion, but management was still management. It required the manager to maintain the position of authority and the managed to stay within the defined boundaries of their role. Every moment of warmth Draven had offered her had been offered from within that architecture, which meant even the warmth had been a form of position maintenance. Kaelin did not manage her. He worked with her. The distinction was the difference between being accommodated and being included, and it was the first time in her adult life that she had experienced the second version with someone who had the authority to offer only the first. She thought about this on day 5 of the 7-day window, when the response came back through the relay. Visera's message was brief and arrived in cipher, and when Seris decoded it, she stood with it in her hands for a long moment before she took it to the command room. The primary route was the Northern Canyon Pass, the widest of the 3, the most logistically manageable for an army of 16,000 with supply lines and heavy equipment. The 2 southern passes were exactly what Rourke had assessed. Diversionary forces, significant enough to require response, but not the main thrust. There was a second piece of information in the message. Seris read it twice. Then she went to the command room. "She's out," she said. Kaelin looked up. "Visera. She got the original document from the Thorn archive. She's moving east with it now. She has," Seris calculated from the timing in the message. "She has 4 days before the mobilized force reaches the frontier boundary. She needs to be ahead of it." "If Thorn knows she's moving," Voss began. "He knows," Seris said. "She says in the message that she has a 2-day lead, but he will have identified her absence by now. He'll have sent riders." She needs an escort, Rourke said. She needs an extraction, Kalen said, and looked at Rourke with a specificity that said this was now Rourke's operational problem. Rourke left the room with the compact urgency of a man who was good at exactly this kind of problem. Kalen looked at Seris. The document, he said. The original, she said. Both copies together, with Vyasira's testimony about the council manipulation and the custody provision insertion. Kalen, this is not just a legal argument anymore. This is documented evidence of systematic structural fraud committed by the Thorn faction against the Crown itself. He was quiet for a moment. Draven will have to respond to that, he said. Draven will have to choose, she said, between acknowledging that his crown has been compromised from inside his own alliance, or defending Thorn to protect the military capacity he signed away his sovereignty to acquire. If he chooses the second, then he is no longer the crown in any meaningful sense, she said. He's a figure Thorn is operating through, and the Northern Council will eventually understand that, and the Council's self-interest will do more damage to Thorn's position than anything we could engineer. This assumes, Kalen said carefully, that we survive the next 7 days to present any of it. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It does. The 7 days became 6 when the Thorn advance scouts reached the frontier boundary, a day ahead of schedule, and they became 5 when Kalen made the decision to move his primary force to the northern canyon rather than wait for the enemy to choose the ground. There was a philosophy in this choice that Seris understood as she watched him make it. The philosophy of a man who had learned through sustained and costly experience that waiting for a stronger force to come to you on your ground was frequently less advantageous than it appeared, because a stronger force that came to you had the psychological momentum of advance, and momentum had military value that numbers alone could not purchase. Better to move. Better to choose the encounter point. Better to be the force that determined where and when, even when the where and when were both unfavorable. She rode out with the primary force on day 5. Kalen had not asked her to stay behind. She had not asked his permission to come. These two facts existing simultaneously was itself a statement about the nature of what had developed between them in the weeks of frontier garrison life, which was not a statement that either of them had made formally or even directly, and which did not require formality to be real. She was not a fighter in the trained military sense. She knew this. She did not perform a version of herself that pretended otherwise. She was something else, and what she was had military value that was different from fighting capacity, but not lesser than it. The northern canyon in early winter was a specific kind of brutal. The rock walls held cold the way stone held everything, completely, without apology, without the modulating warmth that soil or vegetation introduced. The breath of 4,000 soldiers moving at force march pace in that air made a collective vapor that rose above the column like its own weather system. And the sound of that many people and horses and equipment moving through confined stone space was a sound that existed in the body as much as the ear. Seris rode near the front of the column, beside Kalen, and watched the canyon walls and felt her own breathing, and paid attention to the thing in her blood that had been waking in increments and was now, in the cold and the movement and the proximity of consequence, more awake than it had ever been in her controlled and contained palace life. It was not comfortable. Nothing real was comfortable. But it was present, and its presence changed the texture of the air around her in a way she was beginning to be able to direct rather than simply observe. They reached the canyon's primary choke point, a natural narrowing where the walls pressed close enough to reduce an attacking force's width advantage by 2/3 at dawn on day 6. Kalen deployed his forces with the precision of someone who had studied this ground his entire career. Rourke took the left face. A commander named Asha, whose experience was in defensive positioning, and who had a gift for making terrain do the work of numbers, took the right. The center held the cavalry reserve and the command group, with sight lines to both flanks. Seris stood at the command position and looked north up the canyon and watched the first light find the rock walls and thought about Lyra. 31 years of rule, 31 years of independent authority, and then the consolidation and the editing and the careful managed diminishment of everything that had made Lyra a genuine force rather than a ceremonial one. What had it cost Lyra to survive that transition? What did it cost anyone to survive becoming smaller than they were? The cost was not dramatic. That was the thing people did not understand about that specific kind of cost. It did not arrive in a single terrible moment. It accumulated. It accumulated in the 10,000 small compressions, the adjusted postures, the managed expressions, the learned smallness that became indistinguishable from genuine smallness after long enough exposure. And the terrible irony was that the people who survived the compression did so by becoming very good at it, which meant their survival capacity was built on the skill of being less than they were, which meant the survival itself was a form of ongoing damage. Seris had been surviving that way for 7 years. She was done surviving that way. "Movement," said a rider from the northern scout position. The Thorn advance force came through the canyon at mid-morning. They came in the formation of a force that expected resistance, but expected to overcome it, confident, organized, moving with the kind of professional momentum that 12,000 soldiers with operational experience and a numerical advantage naturally generated. The advance units were cavalry, probing the choke point before committing the full weight of the column. The cavalry met Rourke's left flank first. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not something Seris could describe in full from the command position, because command positions were specifically designed to see the whole rather than the parts. And the whole of a battle in a canyon was a thing of sound and movement and information arriving in fragments that required constant integration. What she could see was that the terrain was working. The choke point reduced the cavalry's advantage. The canyon walls prevented flanking. Rourke's left was holding with a discipline that spoke to the quality of Kaelin's frontier force. Not unbroken, because nothing in a real engagement was unbroken, but holding in the specific way of people who had trained for exactly this geography. What she could also see from her position was something Rourke could not see from his: a third force, moving along the eastern canyon rim above the choke point, not cavalry. Infantry, light and moving fast, without the equipment weight of a main assault force. A flanking element that had not been in Viasira's intelligence because it had not been part of Thorn's main force. It was a secondary unit that had moved through a minor pass. Dara's network had identified as impassable for significant force. It was passable for light infantry. 200 soldiers on the rim, in position to fire down into the command group and the cavalry reserve, would change the engagement's mathematics in a way that the choke point could not compensate for. She could see them. She could see that Kaelin could not see them from his angle. She turned her horse toward him, and in the same moment saw his field commander's attention locked on a crisis developing at Asha's right flank position, and understood that she had perhaps 30 seconds before the rim force was in position. "Kaelin," she said. He turned. She pointed. He looked at the rim, and his expression did what she had learned to read as rapid recalculation. Not panic, not shock, the specific gear shift of a military mind updating its model and running new options at speed. "Rourke can't pull without," he began. "I know," she said. She was already thinking about what she had, what was actually there, not performing an assessment, just looking honestly at the real inventory. The rim force was not yet in position. They needed another 10 minutes to reach the optimal firing angle. 10 minutes was not long, but it was specific, and specificity was workable. "I need 20 riders," she said, "and I need them now." He looked at her. This was the moment. She was aware of it as it happened, aware that this was the specific kind of moment that defined what came after it, where a different kind of man would have managed her, would have redirected, would have absorbed the information she had provided and incorporated it into his own solution and positioned her safely back. Kaelin said, "Voss, 20 riders to Lady Seris." She moved before the order was finished. The 20 riders were frontier cavalry who had the specific quality of people who did not need extensive instruction in bad situations. They assessed, they adjusted, they moved. She led them at speed along the eastern canyon base toward the access point she had identified from the command position, a rough trail that the rim force had used and that went up at an angle that made her horse's footing genuinely uncertain and her own hands tight on the reins. She was not afraid. This was the thing that she took note of, academically, in the part of her mind that maintained observation even in the middle of action. She was not afraid. She was moving through something difficult with full awareness of the difficulty and without the specific contraction that fear produced. The thing in her blood had been awake for 6 days. It was very awake now. The trail reached the rim 200 yards south of where the Thorn flank unit was positioned, and she brought the riders up at the trail's end and held there for 3 seconds while she assessed the ground between them and the flank unit. Open rock. No cover, 200 trained soldiers who would turn the moment they heard movement. She had 20 riders. This was not a military calculation that ended favorably. But it was also not a military calculation that required a favorable ending. It required a specific and limited outcome. Not defeating the flank unit, but disrupting its deployment timing long enough for Kaelin to move the cavalry reserve to counter it from below. She had studied Lyra's documented arguments for 3 weeks. The pre-consolidation accounts of what independent Luna authority had actually functioned as in the field. Not ceremonial, not advisory. The thing that had made the Kaelor crown want to subordinate it was the thing that made it genuinely powerful. It had been described differently in different documents, in the imprecise language of people trying to articulate something that did not reduce cleanly to tactical terminology. But the consistent element in every account was this. In the field, in the presence of genuine stakes, a Luna of full standing created a condition in the people and the space around her that changed the quality of decision-making in the immediate vicinity. Not compulsion, nothing so crude, something more like clarity. The artificial noise of fear and adrenaline, and the narratives that those states generated, the voices that said the odds were impossible, that the ground was wrong, that turning back was rational, those voices went quiet in the presence of a Luna operating at full extension. And in the quiet, people made the decisions they would have made if they had not been afraid. Frequently, those decisions were braver than the fear narrative would have allowed. Seris looked at the thorn flank unit on the canyon rim. She looked at the 20 frontier riders beside her. She thought about Lyra, who had made this argument for 31 years and had not been allowed to finish it. She was going to finish it now. She rode out from the trail onto the open rock. She did not charge. She did not call a war cry. She rode out at a controlled pace with 20 riders behind her, and she held the thing in her blood fully open for the first time in her life, without the management, without the compression, without the careful angular geometry. The thorn flank unit saw her immediately. The first thing they did was stop moving into position. This was tactically significant. A military unit that has identified a threat and assessed it as inferior should not stop. It should continue its deployment and address the inferior threat as a secondary problem. The fact that they stopped meant something in the assessment had not computed correctly. Their commander, she could see him, a compact, competent man in thorn military black, turned toward her and his hand went up in the signal to his archers. She kept riding toward them, not fast, not slow. At the pace of someone who understood precisely where they were and had chosen to be there. The archers had arrows on strings, standard response, tactically correct. And yet, they did not loose. She was within 50 yards before the commander found his voice. "Hold position," he said to his unit, then to her. "Identify yourself." She stopped her horse. She looked at him across the open rock of the canyon rim, with the winter sky behind her and the sound of battle. Below them both, and the specific quality of the thing she was carrying fully expressed for the first time without the 7-year editing. "I am Seris Vale," she said. "Last of the Seris bloodline. Pre-consolidation standing. I am invoking the nullification clause of the consolidation accord." The commander stared at her. She had said it on this canyon rim in this moment, because the moment was the right one. Because the accord's nullification required public declaration before witnesses, and 200 soldiers of the Thorn Alliance were witnesses regardless of their alignment. "Your authority here," the commander began, "is documented, legally established, and recognized by the sovereign frontier territories of Alpha King Kaelin Dracar," she said. "What you do next is a choice you are making with that knowledge. I want you to understand that clearly." Below them, the sound of the battle was changing. She could hear it without looking, the cavalry reserve moving, the engagement pattern shifting, the specific acoustic difference between a force with momentum and a force that was being met. Kaelin had moved. The commander looked at his unit, looked at her, made the calculation that was available to him, not the calculation she needed him to make, but the human calculation of a man who had just had the ground of what he understood himself to be doing shifted under him. "Stand down," he said. Not to her, to his unit. The archers lowered their bows. Seris looked at them, at the 200 soldiers who had stopped because something in the quality of the air in her vicinity had created the 30 seconds of quiet that allowed them to hear the actual decision underneath the tactical one, and felt the thing in her blood doing what it had apparently always been built to do. Not commanding, not conquering, clarifying. It was a different kind of power than the palace had ever recognized or the crown had ever permitted, because it was not the kind of power that required hierarchy to function. It did not need to be above something to operate. It simply needed to be present, fully, without editing. She turned back toward the trail. Below on the canyon floor, the engagement was reaching its decisive phase. The cavalry reserve had deployed in the 30-second window she had created. Asha's right flank had stabilized. Rourke's left was pushing back against the advance unit with the specific pressure of a defensive line that has found its footing, 16,000 against 4,000. The math had not changed, but the math was not the whole story. The whole story was that Thorne's army was an integrated military force, and integrated forces had a specific vulnerability that pure numbers did not address. They required trust between their component units. Cavalry trusted that infantry would hold the flank. Infantry trusted that the flank support would arrive. The command structure trusted that the intelligence about the engagement terrain was accurate. When Thorne's flank unit stood down on the rim, the communication of that decision traveled through the military channel to the main force command. And the main force command, receiving the information that a secondary unit had stood down in response to something that its after-action report would describe in imprecise terms, had to make an assessment. Was the secondary unit compromised? Turned? Deceived? Had the terrain been miscalculated? The intelligence had said the eastern passes were impassable for significant force. The secondary unit had gone through one, had been stopped, by something that was not standard military resistance. Thorne's advance command did what military commands in uncertain information environments did. They held their advance to reassess. In a canyon battle with a choke point, holding your advance was a significant and potentially irreversible cost. Kalen understood this. His cavalry, deployed into the holding advance's moment of hesitation, hit the primary force's leading edge with a precision and violence that compressed the engagement into a crisis that the advance could not absorb without the full weight of the column behind it. And the column behind it was still 3 miles north, still receiving and processing the confusing information about the rim unit, still under the impression that the timeline for this engagement was longer than it had just become. Seris came back down the trail on the eastern face and rejoined the command position. The battle was not over, but its shape had changed irrevocably. A battle's shape, once changed, only ran in the new direction. She knew this not from military training, but from the same quality of understanding that had been in Lyra's documented arguments. The understanding that force was not the primary determinant of outcomes. Force was the arena. The determinant was the thing that happened in the gaps between force, in the moments of hesitation and reassessment, and the human calculation that no amount of military pre-planning could fully remove from the variable set. Kalen came back to the command position from the left flank at mid-afternoon. He was not unmarked. There was blood on his left arm from something that had come close enough to leave a record, and his face had the specific exhausted alertness of someone who had been in full operational focus for 6 hours and was not yet ready to stop being in it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The rim unit," he said. "Stood down," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "How?" he said. She thought about the accurate answer. "I held the room," she said. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. Not quite. Something closer to the feeling of a calculation finally resolving into the number that all the previous steps had been pointing toward. "Lyra's argument," he said. "Lyra's argument," she confirmed. I was quiet for a moment in which the battle sounds continued to run their altered course below and around them. 4,000 frontier soldiers pressing a decisive advantage against a force that was significantly larger and considerably more confused than it had been at dawn. "The document," Kalen said. "By Asira." "She's either through the lines or she isn't," Seris said. "Rourke sent the extraction team 4 days ago. Then we wait." "We wait," he agreed. The afternoon moved toward evening, and the engagement at the choke point resolved in the specific grinding way that canyon engagements resolved. Not in a single decisive moment, but in a progressive compression of the advancing force's options until retreat became the only choice with less cost than continuing. The Thorne advance pulled back at sunset, not a rout. A tactical withdrawal, ordered, maintained, the specific dignity of a professional military extracting itself from an engagement that had not gone as planned. Thorne's commander knew the value of preserving his force for the next day's options. There would be a next day. 16,000 soldiers with a supply line and a command structure did not retreat from one engagement and disappear. They regrouped. They reassessed. They came back. But they came back into a different situation than the one they had entered this morning. Seris stood on the canyon rim in the last light, and looked north at the withdrawing force, and felt the thing in her blood settle back into a lower register. Not dormant, not the suppressed version, but the resting state of something that had finally been allowed to exist at full extension and had found its own natural level. A runner came up the trail to the rim with the specific pace of someone carrying urgent information. She turned. The runner was one of Rourke's people, young, breathing hard from the climb. "Lady Seris," he said, "the extraction team came through the southern pass an hour ago." She felt something unlock in her chest. "Vaesira," she said. "Yes, ma'am, and—" He stopped for a moment that had a specific quality of someone managing the delivery of something significant. "Your brother, Kyle. He's with them." Her brother. Kale, who had been asking about spring barley projections. Kale, who had spent the last weeks in Crown custody for the crime of being related to someone who had decided to stop being managed. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh and breathed through her nose and told herself she had time for the full weight of that later, when the next 24 hours had resolved into something that allowed for the wait. "My mother," she said. The runner's expression did the thing that expressions did when the news was not complete. "The custody transfer was only partially successful," he said. "Lady Mira Seris remains in northern custody." Mira's contact inside the custody structure could only move one. Kale had been moved, her mother had not. She stood on the canyon rim with the last light failing and the sound of a withdrawing army below her and the specific weight of a calculation that had just become more personal than it had ever been. And she felt the thing in her blood do something she had not felt from it before. Not the clarity-making quality, not the room-holding, something harder and colder and more foundational than either of those. The thing that lived underneath strategy. The thing that Lyra had apparently carried into 31 years of independent rule, and that the Kaelor crown had spent a generation trying to breed out of the Seris bloodline, because it was the specific quality that made a Luna house ungovernable by external authority. Not power. Will. Kaelin reached the rim and stood beside her and followed her sightline north toward the withdrawing force, and then looked at her face and read from it the thing that the runner had just delivered. "Your mother," he said. "Still in custody," she said. "Tomorrow changes that," he said. "The document Vaesira carried." "Tomorrow is not here yet," she said. "And Thorn has 16,000 soldiers who came back from today's engagement with a specific set of lessons about this terrain that they are going to apply tomorrow with the specific adaptations that professional military forces apply when they have been surprised once and are not willing to be surprised again." He was quiet. "They're going to split the force," she said. "Tomorrow, they're not hitting the choke point with the primary column. They're going to use the numbers to hit all three passes simultaneously and accept the cost of the two diversionary passes in exchange for a genuine multi-front engagement that spreads our 4,000 across a geography it cannot adequately cover." "Yes," he said. "And the nullification document and Vaesira's testimony are not military assets," she said. "They are political and legal instruments that require a functioning tribunal and a surviving frontier territory to deploy. If tomorrow ends badly enough, then they become historical record rather than active leverage," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back. The last light on the canyon rim made his face something spare and specific, the weather marks and the battle day's accumulated cost. And underneath all of it, the particular quality that had been consistent since the first time she had stood in his command room and understood that she was in the presence of someone who did not manage the truth to make it easier to carry. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She looked north at the withdrawing force. She thought about tomorrow. About 16,000 soldiers adapting. About 4,000 frontier defenders spread across terrain they knew, and an enemy that was learning it. About her mother in a northern custody room, and Kyle somewhere below her on the southern pass with Vaesira and the document that changed everything, if they survived to use it. She thought about Draven in the palace, reading her message through Vaesira's relay. 40 days to make a choice. The 40 days had become 23. The choice was still available to him. It was a smaller window now. And she thought about what it would mean to reach the morning after tomorrow with everything still in motion. "I need to send another message," she said. "Not through Vaesira's relay, directly." "To whom?" he said. She looked at him. "To Draven," she said. "Not the message Vaesira carried. A different one. The one that was always going to have to be sent eventually. The one that tells him specifically what tomorrow looks like, what the document contains, And what the only version of this is that doesn't end with his crown being defined by what Thorn does with it. You're offering him a last exit, Kaelin said. I'm giving him the information he needs to make the choice he has 24 hours to make, she said. Because if he makes it, if Draven Kaelor looks at the shape of what his court has allowed to happen and decides that defending Thorn's fraud is less important than whatever is left of what he actually built, then tomorrow becomes a different kind of day. And if he doesn't, Kaelin said. She looked at the last edge of light on the canyon rim, at the rock that held cold without apology, at the sky above it all going dark with the specific clarity of a winter night that was going to be very cold and very long, and would end with a dawn that had already decided what it was going to be, regardless of what anyone in its path had planned. Then tomorrow, she said, we fight with what we have. She turned from the rim. Get me a courier, she said, the fastest one who knows the northern roads. Below on the canyon floor, 4,000 soldiers were setting camp in the dark, building fires against the cold, eating and checking wounds and doing the specific human work of preparing to be ready again by dawn. Kaelin watched her go. In his face was something she did not see because her back was already turned. It was the expression of a man who had spent 11 years building toward a specific kind of reckoning and had discovered somewhere in the last 23 days that the reckoning had acquired a dimension he had not included in 11 years of preparation, and that this dimension was not a complication. It was the part that made the rest of it worth the cost. The courier rode north through the dark. The document waited with Viasira below the southern pass. Kyle was alive. Dawn was coming. And 16,000 soldiers were setting their own fires 3 miles north, making their own preparations, adapting with the professional competence of a force that had been surprised once and would not be surprised again. The canyon held its cold. The night held its dark. And somewhere between the courier's departure and the dawn's arrival, the last 24 hours of everything that had been building since a palace hall and a silver dress, and 3 seconds of acknowledgement across a crowded room were going to turn into whatever came next. She did not know if it was enough. She knew it was everything she had. For the first time in her life, those two things felt like the same thing. The courier came back before dawn, not with a response from Draven, with a rider wearing northern crown colors who was not the courier at all, and who arrived at the frontier garrison camp not under flag of aggression, but under the specific white marker that meant negotiation, the oldest communication protocol in the Empire, older than the Kaelor line itself, old enough that even Thorn's military authority could not override it without destroying the legal framework that legitimized his alliance. Seris was awake when they brought him in. She had not slept. She had spent the dark hours with Kyle, who had been given a room in the garrison and who had sat with her for 3 hours, not talking about politics or documents or the shape of what was coming at dawn, but talking about the northeastern estates and the barley yield, and whether the drainage on the eastern field had been properly maintained in her absence. She had needed that conversation more than she understood before it happened. Kale was 19 and practical, and had his mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness, and sitting with him in a frontier garrison room talking about drainage, while 16,000 soldiers camped 3 miles north, was the most honest thing she had done in weeks. It reminded her what the argument was actually for. Not the legal framework, not the political architecture, not even Lyra's 31 years of independent rule. The drainage on the eastern field. The spring barley. The ordinary human life that required stable ground to grow in, and the specific question of who got to decide what stable meant and for whom. The courier had not come back. The northern rider under white marker was not the courier, which meant one of two things. Either the courier had been intercepted before reaching Draven, or Draven had sent his own response through a different channel because he did not want the communication to be traceable to the courier she had sent. The second possibility meant the communication was something Draven did not want attributed to him officially. The second possibility meant it was genuine. She met the rider in the command room with Kaelin beside her and Dara in the corner, doing what Dara always did in information-receiving situations, which was listen with the specific quality of someone who would remember every word with perfect accuracy and assess it against every other piece of information she held simultaneously. The writer was a young man with the look of someone from the Palace Diplomatic Corps, educated, controlled, trained to carry messages without editorializing them. He delivered the message verbatim, as Diplomatic Corps writers were trained to do. Draven Kaelor, Crown Prince of the Northern Empire, acknowledged receipt of the communication delivered through the frontier relay. He acknowledged the existence of the Consolidation Accord nullification clause and the documentation of Thorn factional manipulation of the Crown Council process. He acknowledged that the custody provision in the conspiracy decree had been inserted without his direct knowledge or approval. He requested a meeting, personal, without military escort, on the canyon floor, before dawn. The writer finished and stood in the silence. Kaylin looked at her. She looked at the writer. "Did he say anything beyond the formal message?" she said. The writer was quiet for a moment, the specific hesitation of someone deciding whether informal content fell within his mandate. "He said," the writer said carefully, "to tell you that he read the message 3 times, and that the 3rd time was the one that was honest." She nodded. "Tell him yes," she said. The writer left. Kaylin looked at her. "This could be a removal operation," he said. It was not a warning against going. It was information, offered cleanly, that she had the right to hold while making her decision. "It could," she said. "The timing, before the dawn engagement. He solves 2 problems simultaneously." "He could," she said. "But Draven has never solved problems that way. It's not his methodology. He manages and positions and maneuvers, but he doesn't remove. It's the one limit I always trusted about him." "People under sufficient pressure," Kaylin began. "Change," she said. "Yes. But the pressure that changes a person's fundamental methodology is existential. Draven's situation is bad. It is not yet existential. He still has the crown. He still has options. A man with options still plays his actual game." Kaylin was quiet. "I'm going," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm coming." She looked at him. "Not as a guard," he said. "As the sovereign frontier authority whose legal recognition of the Seris bloodline is the other half of what that meeting is actually about. Whatever Draven wants to negotiate, he's negotiating with both of us. He may not know that yet. He needs to know it before the conversation starts." She understood. "Yes," she said. They rode to the canyon floor in the last of the dark, just the 2 of them and 4 riders who kept a distance that was respectful rather than protective. And the cold was the specific deep cold of a night that has given up its last warmth before sunrise, the kind of cold that settled into the lungs and made each breath a small defined thing. Draven was already there. I was alone. She checked the canyon walls and the approach road with the attention she had learned in the frontier and found no secondary positions, no hidden elements, genuinely alone, which was either the bravest or the most desperate thing she had seen him do in 7 years. He stood beside his horse in the canyon floor in riding clothes without ceremony or court dress, and in the darkness before dawn he looked smaller than the palace had always made him look. Not diminished exactly, but human in a way that the palace architecture and the silver fire and the 300 witnesses had never allowed. He looked at her when she dismounted. Then he looked at Kaylin. Something moved in his face. "Alpha Dracar," he said. "Crown Prince," Kaylin said. He said it without the political weight that titles carried in the capital. Just 2 people acknowledging what they were to each other in the current arrangement. Draven looked back at Seris. For a moment neither of them said anything. She had thought about this moment. She had not planned it, specifically, because she had learned enough in the past weeks to understand that planning conversations of this nature created a script, and scripts required the other person to say the right lines, and real conversations did not work that way. But she had thought about it. She had thought about what 7 years of proximity to someone looked like from the other side of 3 weeks on a frontier garrison and a canyon battle, and the specific education of learning what you actually were. "You read it 3 times, she said. "The first time," Draven said, "I read it as a threat. And the second, as a legal instrument." He paused. "The 3rd time I read it as what it was." "What was it?" she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the management expression. Not the warmth that was rationed. Not the 3-second acknowledgement across the palace hall. Something underneath all of those things, the version that existed before any of the performance layers had been added. "The truth," he said, "about what I built, and what I let in, and what it cost." She held his gaze. "My mother," she said. "Released this morning," he said, "before I rode here. It was the first order I issued without consulting the council in—" He stopped. "In a long time." She registered this. She did not perform relief because relief was not what she felt yet. Confirmation was what she needed, and confirmation required Dara's network, which would have the information within hours. "The Thorn Force," she said. Is operating under Aldrich Thorne's direct command, Draven said. Not mine. That distinction, Kaelin said, speaking for the first time since the titles, is going to require a great deal more than your personal testimony to establish before a tribunal. Draven looked at him. There was a specific quality to the look, a man assessing another man not as a political variable, but as a genuine force, the kind of assessment that happened when hierarchy dissolved, and what was left was just the real evaluation. I know, Draven said. The Consolidation Accord nullification, Kaelin said. The documentation of council manipulation. Vaasira Thorne's testimony. These established the legal framework for a formal tribunal review of every arrangement the Northern Court has built on the subordination of Luna authority. That review will reach conclusions that are uncomfortable for the Crown, regardless of Thorne's specific culpability. I know that too, Draven said. Then what are you here to negotiate? Seris said. He looked at her. She felt the weight of it land in the room the air made between them. This was the question she had needed to ask since the palace hall. Not what are you choosing, not what do you want, but the specific and ruthless version. What are you actually here for? Because Draven had spent 7 years being the person who arrived in situations with an agenda already formed, and she needed to know whether that had changed or whether this conversation was the most sophisticated version of management he had yet attempted. I came, he said, because you told me the truth when you didn't have to. When you sent the message through via Seris Relay and then again tonight. You could have let tomorrow happen and used the outcome as leverage. You chose to tell me what was actually true instead. I'm not interested in leverage, she said. I said that in the message. I know, he said. That's why I believed it. He reached into his riding coat and produced a document case, the formal sealed kind that carried legal instruments, and held it out toward her. She did not take it. She looked at it. What is this? She said. A formal Crown acknowledgement, he said, of the Seris bloodline's pre-consolidation standing, of the nullification clause, of the Luna sovereignty question as a legitimate matter for tribunal review. He held it steady. It doesn't solve everything. It doesn't undo what the consolidation did or what my family built on the assumption that it would hold. But it is the Northern Crown officially stating that the question is open, that the argument Lyra was making 30 years ago deserved to be heard, that it was suppressed improperly. The canyon was very quiet. Seris looked at the document case. She thought about the night in the linen alcove, the list with 3 names and Kaelin Drakar's name at the bottom, the 9 days on the road east, Lyra's documents in the Frontier Archive, full of gaps where the argument had been edited into silence. She thought about what it meant to receive this, not the legal content. She understood the legal content. Kaelin and Dara would need to review the actual text before it was actionable, and she was not naive enough to accept a document case at face value in a canyon in the dark before a military engagement. The legal content would be verified. What she was thinking about was what it meant in the human register. What it meant that Draven Kaelor had ridden alone to a canyon floor before dawn to offer this specific acknowledgement to the woman he had looked at for 3 seconds across a palace hall and decided could survive the calculation he was making. He had been wrong about what she would survive. He had been wrong about the kind of wrong that people with significant power were frequently wrong about, the kind that assumed the people they moved like pieces on a board were the pieces, and not the people. That assumed survival meant static endurance rather than transformation. That assumed the woman in the silver dress would remain the woman in the silver dress, because the palace had always been the context that defined her. She reached out and took the document case. This is the beginning of a process, she said, not an ending. I know, he said. The tribunal will not be friendly to the Crown. I know that too. And Thorne, she said, your military alliance, your great strategic asset. Draven was quiet for a moment that had real weight in it. Aldrich Thorne moved 16,000 soldiers based on his own operational timeline without my approval, he said. He inserted provisions into Crown decrees without my knowledge. He positioned his daughter in the Crown alliance as an intelligence asset while negotiating with me as a partner. He paused. I have been telling myself that this is the cost of strategic alliance, that the compromises were acceptable because the military capacity was real and necessary. And now, Seris said, now I have 16,000 of his soldiers 3 miles north of here, and they are not waiting for my orders, he said. They are waiting for his, And I understand, finally, the specific meaning of that distinction. He had let the wolf in the door for the strength of its teeth. I was standing in the canyon floor in the dark, describing the precise quality of the bite. She thought about what it had cost him to ride here and say this. Not in political terms. The political cost was enormous, and she understood it clearly. But in the human terms underneath the political ones, Draven had built an identity around never being the one who made the wrong calculation. He had made himself into the version of power that justified everything through the quality of the result. And standing in this canyon describing how completely the result had escaped his architecture was, for a man like him, the specific kind of cost that lived in the body rather than the ledger. She did not feel satisfaction at this. She had thought she might. She had thought there would be something gratifying about watching the edifice of his certainty develop the cracks she had felt from underneath it for years. What she felt instead was something more complicated and more human than gratification, something closer to grief. Not for herself, not the grief she had processed and moved through. Grief for the specific waste of it, for the 7 years and the managed warmth and the silver dress and the 3 seconds. For the version of things that might have been, if he had been capable, earlier, of the honesty he was offering now in a canyon in the dark. It had not been available to him earlier. That was not an excuse. It was a fact about the specific kind of person his particular formation had produced. He had needed to lose in order to be honest. A great many people did. The tragedy was not that they needed the loss, it was that the loss was so often paid by the people around them rather than by themselves. I want Thorn held accountable, she said, not managed. Not absorbed into a new arrangement, held accountable by a legitimate tribunal for the council manipulation, the fraudulent decree insertion, and the unauthorized military mobilization. Yes, Draven said. I want the tribunal to have standing independent of the Northern Crown Council. Frontier legal authority must be represented. He looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked at him. The Eastern Frontier, Kaelin said, has maintained independent legal standing for 11 years. We are prepared to participate in a joint tribunal with full equivalent authority. Draven was quiet for a moment, for Seris understood what this cost him. Not the tribunal itself, the equal authority. Accepting that the frontier stood beside the crown rather than beneath it. Accepting that the Consolidation Accord's premise about what Northern authority encompassed had been, legally and morally, wrong. Yes, he said. The dawn was starting, not dramatically. Not the sudden sharp sunrise of summer, but the slow winter process of the dark becoming less dark by increments, the canyon walls resolving out of shadow into the actual color of cold stone. 3 miles north, 16,000 soldiers were waking to a morning they had expected to use differently. The military engagement, Seris said. I will send orders to Thorn's advance command, Draven said. Officially, in writing, under full Crown authority, ordering the withdrawal of Northern Crown garrison forces from the Thorn Alliance mobilization. He won't comply, Kaelin said. No, Draven agreed. He won't. But the order will exist in writing, which means when the tribunal reviews the chain of command authority, it will be documented that the Crown ordered withdrawal and Thorn refused. That distinction matters for what the tribunal can reach. It also, Seris said quietly, means that when the engagement happens this morning, the Northern Crown garrison soldiers will have received an order to withdraw. Some of them will follow it. The number 4,000 against 16,000 had just shifted in a way that no military analyst watching from outside the conversation would be able to quantify precisely, but that every person in the canyon felt in the quality of the air. Draven looked at her. There's something else, he said. She waited. Vaesira, he said. She's been designated a traitor by her father's faction within the council. If the tribunal doesn't move quickly, Thorn will attempt to have her dealt with. She's under Eastern Frontier protection, Kaelin said. Frontier protection doesn't reach inside Northern territory, Draven said. She has family. Thorn has those connections. He will use them. Seris thought about Vaesira riding 300 miles in civilian clothes. The document retrieved from her father's archive. The message decoded from a passage in a pre-consolidation text. 2 women who had been positioned inside structures they did not design, making the choice to step outside the architecture at different moments and different costs. Then the tribunal convenes within 10 days, Seris said. Not on northern soil, neutral ground, the frontier boundary, if Kaelin agrees. The frontier boundary, Kalen said, is acceptable. Draven looked at both of them in the growing light. She watched him process the full weight of what this morning had become. He had ridden here as a crown prince, attempting to manage an escalating situation through a combination of genuine concession and strategic positioning. He was leaving. She watched the moment of understanding arrive in his face, as the signing party of an arrangement that had just fundamentally altered the power architecture of the Northern Empire. The Consolidation Accord, formally challenged. Luna sovereignty, formally acknowledged as an open question. Thorn factional authority, formally separated from crown authority. A joint tribunal with equivalent frontier legal standing. This was not what he had come to negotiate. This was what the truth had been building towards since a palace hall in a silver dress, and the specific calculation that a woman could survive being a placeholder. He looked at Seris with the winter light coming into the canyon and doing something honest to his face, removing the palace architecture's careful illumination, just leaving the actual man in the actual cold morning. "I'm sorry," he said. The two words sat between them. She looked at them, the way she looked at things now, not deflecting, not managing her response, just letting the full weight of the thing reach her without armor. She thought about what those two words deserved. Not acceptance as absolution, not the performed magnanimity of a victor being gracious. Something more honest than either. "I know you are," she said. "That's the part that's too late." He held her gaze. She gave him credit for that, for not looking away from it. "The part that isn't too late," she said, "is what you do from this morning forward. The tribunal, the documentation, the honest accounting of what the crown built on suppressed authority. That part is still available to you. And if I do it," he said, "all of it, correctly, then the history of what was built gets to be complicated instead of simple," she said. "Complicated is harder than simple, but it's more accurate, and accuracy is what Lyra was arguing for 30 years ago. Not revenge, not conquest, just the accurate account." He nodded. It was a small motion, not the performance of authority acknowledging a point, just a man in a canyon in the early morning light, receiving something true and carrying it without pretending it was lighter than it was. He mounted his horse. He looked at Kalen one more time. "My garrison forces will receive written withdrawal orders before the hour is out," he said. "We'll be watching for them," Kalen said. "Not a threat. A fact about how frontier borders maintain themselves." Draven rode north. She watched him until the canyon absorbed the sound of the hooves. Then she stood in the early light with Kalen beside her and felt the morning arrive fully into the canyon, the cold stone beginning the long, slow work of accepting what warmth was available to it, which was not much but was real. "He'll hold," Kalen said. "Not a prediction, an assessment." "He'll hold," she agreed. "Not because he's suddenly different, because the cost of not holding is now higher than the cost of holding. That's the only mathematics he's ever operated on. And that's enough," Kalen said. "It's enough for the tribunal," she said. "It's enough for the legal process. It's enough for the accurate account." She paused. "It's not enough to be the person I needed him to be 7 years ago. But I stopped needing him to be that person somewhere on the road east." The canyon was holding the morning light now, the stone doing what stone did, absorbing slowly, reluctantly, but permanently. Once cold stone accepted warmth, it held it longer than anything else. She thought about that. She thought about permanence, about the things that once changed could not be changed back. Not the legal architecture alone, but the human one. The version of herself that had stood in the silver dress and believed endurance was the same thing as belonging. That version was not coming back. You could not unbecome what a frontier garrison and a sovereignty declaration and a canyon battle and a meeting in the dark had made you. She did not want to unbecome it. Below the southern pass, Kael was probably awake and asking someone about the garrison's agricultural supply chain. Her mother, if Draven's word was real. And Dara would confirm it, and she was allowing herself to believe it was real because the alternative was a kind of constant armor that cost more than it was worth. Her mother was moving toward the northern gates of whatever facility had held her, moving toward the specific ordinary freedom of a woman who had been briefly imprisoned for her daughter's choices, and who would have something to say about that when they were finally in the same room. Seris found herself almost smiling at that. Her mother would have a great deal to say. She looked at Kalen. "I was watching the north end of the canyon with the attention of a man running calculations about what was developing militarily and what the morning's orders would mean for the engagement timeline. The practical mind doing its practical work, the same mind that had taught her through demonstrated example rather than instruction. That authority did not require performance, and strength did not require smallness in others. She had a thought about this that she wanted to say, and she had learned in the frontier weeks that the impulse to say a true thing directly was worth honoring because managed communication was the specific tool that had distorted every relationship she had valued. "You never told me what to be," she said. He looked at her. "You showed me things," she said. "You gave me access to situations. You made the case for the document and the declaration and the strategic position, but you never once told me what to be inside them." "No," he said. "Why?" she said. "The actual reason. Because you could have. I was 300 miles from the only world I knew, and I would have," she was honest with this, "I would have been susceptible to someone who offered a clear definition of what I should become." I was quiet for a moment. "Because I had 11 years of preparation for a specific strategic outcome," he said, "and in week 1 of you being in my garrison, I understood that whatever you were was not going to be useful to that outcome if it was shaped by my agenda. That it only had the value I had been waiting for if it was completely its own." "That's still strategic," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is. I'm not going to claim it was purely selfless. It wasn't." He looked at her directly. "But the thing that made it strategic was real. What you carry is real. I knew that before you did. And the only way to be in the presence of something real without corrupting it is to stop trying to be the authority over it." She held this. It was the most honest thing he had said to her directly, and it had the specific quality of honesty that did not ask for a particular response. It was not performing vulnerability, not asking for reassurance, not positioning toward an outcome. It was just accurate. "Lyra's argument," she said. "The thing she spent 31 years making." "Yes." She was right. "Yes," he said again. "The version that gets made now. The tribunal, the legal process, the reconstruction of what the consolidation did. That's not going to look like what Lyra envisioned." She was arguing from a specific pre-consolidation structure that doesn't exist anymore. The world that exists now requires something different. "What does it require?" he said. She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks in the records room and 2 days on the canyon wall and one night talking to Kael about drainage. "It requires," she said, "that the architecture stop being built on the assumption that any authority is inherently subordinate. Luna, Frontier, Northern, every piece of the empire that was told to be smaller than it was in service of a centralized crown that claimed to hold the whole. All of it requires a reconstruction that starts from the individual sovereignty of each component rather than the assigned hierarchy." "That's a complete renegotiation of the imperial structure," he said. "Yes," she said. "That takes years." "Yes. It will be resisted at every stage by every entity that benefits from the current hierarchy." "Yes," she said for the 3rd time. "But the argument is now on the record. Lyra's argument, with documentation, with legal standing, with frontier recognition, and with the Northern Crown's own acknowledgement that the question is legitimately open. Once that is on the record and the tribunal confirms it, the resistance is no longer defending an unchallenged assumption. It is defending a challenged one. That's a different argument to defend." He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of something being fully seen. "You've become a different person," he said, "than the woman who came through my checkpoint." "Yes," she said. "Not because of what happened to you." "No," she said. "Because of what I stopped editing." The northern end of the canyon produced the first sounds of movement, distant, organized, the acoustic signature of a large military force receiving new orders and beginning to restructure. The Thorn advanced command, adjusting to information they had not planned for. Some of the Northern Crown garrison soldiers, receiving written withdrawal orders, making the individual calculation about what they were actually obligated to follow. It was not over. None of this was simply over. Thorn still had 16,000 soldiers and a network of political relationships and the particular durability of a man who had spent 30 years building toward exactly this position. The tribunal would be contested. The reconstruction of the imperial architecture would be slow and fractious and frequently maddening. There would be setbacks, reversals, moments where the legitimate argument lost ground to the illegitimate one because power did not gracefully relinquish the structures that served it. She knew this. She was not standing in the canyon floor at first light under the impression that one morning's negotiation and one document case and one admission of cost had resolved the structural reality of 3 generations of suppressed authority. What had been resolved was simpler and more foundational than any of that. The argument was now on the record. Lyra's argument, Seris's argument, the argument that had been edited into silence and managed into subordination, strategically suppressed, because the Kaelor crown had understood from the beginning that it was strong enough to dismantle the architecture they had built on its absence. It was spoken now, in a canyon, under white marker, with the sovereign recognition of the eastern frontier and the formal acknowledgement of the northern crown and the legal standing of a pre-consolidation bloodline that had spent 3 weeks remembering what it actually was. It was spoken, and it could not be unspoken. That was what Lyra had been trying to do. That was what Seris had finished. She turned from the northern end of the canyon and found Kaelin looking at her with the winter water eyes in the morning light. And in his face was the expression she had learned to recognize as his genuine version. Not the assessment face, not the command face, not the controlled compression of a man managing significant decisions. The face that was simply present, without agenda, without performance. The face of someone who had waited 11 years for a specific reckoning and had discovered somewhere in 23 days that the reckoning was larger and better and more human than the version he had been preparing for. She looked back at him. There was a great deal that existed between them that neither of them had named formally or directly, and she had learned enough in the frontier weeks to understand that some things did not require formal naming to be real. The bond between them had not developed through declaration or fantasy or the managed warmth of rationed affection. It had developed through the specific accumulation of honest work done beside each other under real stakes. And that kind of bond had a different structural integrity than the kind built on need or performance. It was the kind that did not require the other person to be smaller to function. She understood now why that had been rare in her experience. Most authority-based relationships required asymmetry to maintain themselves, required one person to manage the other's size in order to preserve their own. Draven had not done this maliciously. He had done it because it was the only architecture available to him within the structure his formation had provided. Kaelin had offered a different architecture, not because he was without ambition or strategy or the specific calculating quality of a man who had maintained independent sovereignty against a larger empire for 11 years. All of those things were real and present. But the architecture he offered did not require her diminishment as a precondition for its function. That was the thing. That was the specific and simple thing. The tribunal, she said. 10 days, he said. My mother will need time to reach the frontier boundary. She'll have time, he said. Visera will need protection during the process. She has it, he said. The documents will need to be authenticated by independent archival authority before the tribunal convenes. Dara is already arranging it, he said. She looked at him. You knew the morning was going to end this way, she said. I hoped, he said. And then, more quietly, I hoped because you sent the message. A person who sends that message in that situation is a person who still believes the truth can do something besides wound. And if that belief was still intact after everything the Northern Court did to it, then yes, I hoped. She thought about this message. The courier riding north through the dark. The choice to offer the information before the battle rather than after it, when it would have served purely as leverage. She had made that choice because Lyra had spent 31 years arguing for the accurate account, and the accurate account required her to give Draven the truth before the consequences, not after, because after was coercion and before was something that at least carried the possibility of being heard clearly. She had not been certain it would be heard. She had done it anyway. That's the thing about this argument, she said. The thing Lyra knew and the court never understood. The reason it was dangerous enough to suppress rather than just debate. Tell me, he said. It wasn't a power argument, she said. It was dressed like one, framed like one, opposed like one. But the actual argument was about what power is for. Lyra wasn't arguing that Luna authority deserved to dominate. She was arguing that the Empire's architecture was built on the wrong foundation, that centralized dominance, no matter how efficiently structured, created a system where the people inside it could only survive by editing themselves into the shape the system required, and that an empire full of edited people was not stronger for their compliance. It was more fragile. The canyon held the morning light now fully, the cold beginning its long, slow, reluctant warm. An empire of edited people, Kaylin said. Breaks, she said, the moment someone stops editing. He looked at her with something she recognized now, without needing to analyze it. You stopped, he said. Somewhere between the linen closet and your checkpoint, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued in the first weeks as something more honest than a smile. The expression that meant a thing had landed in him accurately rather than approximately. They stood together in the canyon floor in the morning light, the sounds of military restructuring in the distance, the specific quality of a day that had not yet decided what it would become, but that had been tilted irrevocably towards something different from what the night before had promised. And she felt the thing in her blood at its full resting extension, not suppressed, not performing, just present. The Empire would remember many things about what followed. It would remember the tribunal. The Consolidation Accord formally challenged and partially nullified. The Thorn faction dismantled through a legal process that took 14 months and produced a documentary record of systematic council manipulation that became the foundational case study for imperial governance reform for the next generation. It would remember Aldrich Thorn's formal removal from military command authority and Viasira's testimony, delivered with a precision that her father had apparently taught her without understanding what he was building. It would remember the Northern Crown's formal concession on Luna sovereignty as a legitimate question, the long reconstruction of the arrangements built on its assumed resolution. It would remember Lyra's argument, finally completed. What it would not fully capture, because these were not the things that institutional records preserved with accuracy, was the smaller texture of what came after. The drainage on the northeastern field, finally properly addressed in the second year following the tribunal, when Seris returned to the family estates that had been restored with full standing. Kale's spring barley yield, which was excellent, as he had suspected it would be if the drainage was handled correctly. Her mother's long and exasperated and deeply loving account of the 3 weeks in Crown custody, delivered over the course of an entire evening, that Seris spent sitting on the floor of the family library listening to every word. The quiet years that accumulated between the frontier garrison and the family estates, and the specific geography of a life that had been built on chosen foundations rather than assigned ones. Kaylin, who moved between the eastern frontier and the northeastern territories with the ease of someone whose world had expanded rather than consolidated, who sat across tables with her in the same working quality she had first experienced in his command room, and which had not diminished with familiarity. If anything, it had deepened, the way things deepened when they were allowed to be what they actually were over time. Not a rescued woman. Not a political alliance. Two people who had found each other's honesty in a canyon and had built something on it that did not require either of them to be smaller than they were. That was the part the records could not hold fully. That was the part she carried in the specific way you carried things that had become part of the structure of your understanding rather than items you stored separately. She thought, on the quiet mornings that were the best mornings, about Lyra. 31 years of independent rule before the consolidation. 31 years of making an argument that the court had suppressed because it was dangerous. Dangerous, not because it threatened violence or destabilized military capacity, but because it told the truth about the foundation. Lyra had not been wrong. She had been premature. The world she was arguing into had not yet developed the specific circumstances that would make the argument hearable. The standing, the documentation, the Eastern Frontier's sovereign recognition, the Northern Crown's own internal fragmentation. All of these were conditions Lyra had not had available to her. She had made the argument anyway, into a court that could not hear it, and the argument had survived her, through the edited records and the managed bloodline and the careful selective suppression, because truth had a specific durability that was not dependent on the institutional systems that attempted to contain it. It survived in the gaps, in the absences with shape, in the documents that preserved what the Northern archives removed, because some territories had never agreed to adopt the Northern version of history. The argument had waited, and the world had eventually produced someone with the specific combination of bloodline and personal cost and frontier circumstance and the particular quality of presence that could not be performed. Someone who had learned, through 7 years of careful compression followed by 3 weeks of deliberate extension, what she actually was. And the argument had been finished, not perfectly. Nothing was finished perfectly, but completely. On the record, permanent. She stood sometimes on the northeastern estate's eastern ridge in the early morning, in the kind of winter light that was cold and specific and made everything it touched very clear, and she thought about the woman in the silver dress who had stood under the crystal chandeliers believing endurance was the same as belonging. She thought about her with something that was not quite tenderness, and not quite grief, and not quite pride. Something in the family of all three. That woman had done what she could with what she understood herself to have. She had endured correctly, by the lights available to her. And then the lights had changed, and endurance had become insufficient, and the thing that had been underneath the endurance all along had finally had the space and the stakes and the specific honesty of a frontier garrison in winter to become what it had always been building toward. The Empire did not fear her. It respected her. She had learned, finally, the difference. The world was not fixed. It was not resolved into permanent safety or guaranteed justice, or the clean resolution of every structural unfairness built into 3 generations of managed architecture. It was complicated and slow and frequently resistant to the accurate account. But the argument was on the record, Lyra's argument, hers, the accurate account of what power was for, and what it cost when it confused dominance with function, and what became possible when the people inside its architecture stopped editing themselves into the shape it required. That was on the record now. And it could not be unspoken, and sometimes, on the eastern ridge in the early morning light, she thought that was enough. Not everything. Not all she wanted, but enough. The foundation that everything else could be built on, and she turned back toward the house and the morning work, and the life she had built on chosen ground.